Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. The Grave Entity. I've always been drawn to stories, those tales that linger in the corners of small towns, passed down in whispers and hushed voices. In my hometown in Arkansas, there's a cemetery that everyone knows about. It's not the kind of place you visit on a Sunday afternoon, but the kind of place whispered about when the sun dips below the horizon. The cemetery sits on the outskirts of town, half hidden by a stretch of trees and dense underbrush. Most people avoid it. They say the place is cursed, haunted by a spirit that never rests. I didn't believe in any of it, of course. Those stories were just that, stories. Tales made up to scare children or keep them out of trouble. But then there's always that one voice that catches your attention, that one story that feels different. And for me, that voice came from old Mrs. Simmons, who ran the small general store near the town square. Her hand shook as she handed me the change, her eyes darting nervously to the window. It was a slow evening, with the storm clouds rolling in over the hills, and the store was nearly empty. "You're curious, aren't you, Alex?" she asked in a soft voice. I looked up from the bag of chips I was picking out. "About what?" "The cemetery," she said, her eyes never meeting mine. "Don't go there, boy. There's something in those woods. Something you don't want to mess with." I raised an eyebrow, feeling the usual skepticism rise. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Simmons leaned in, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "They say it's the spirit of a woman who died long ago. She haunts that cemetery, keeps the dead company. And those who go in, they never come out the same. Some don't come out at all." I smiled, though it didn't quite reach my eyes. "Is that so? Sounds like a good Halloween tale." She didn't smile back. Her eyes were distant, like she was seeing something far beyond the walls of the store. "You think what you want, Alex. But I've seen it. I've heard the cries at night. It's not just a story." I took the change, trying not to show how unsettled I felt. I couldn't shake the thought of what she had said. Mrs. Simmons wasn't the type to tell tall tales. There was a quiet weight to her words, as though she had lived through something that made her believe in the impossible. As I stepped out of the store into the damp evening air, I found myself staring down the road that led to the cemetery. The wind had picked up, and the trees rustled in the distance. My curiosity, always my greatest strength and my greatest weakness, began to itch at the back of my mind. I had to know if there was any truth to the legend. The first seeds of doubt were planted that evening. I had always thought of myself as a practical person. I didn't believe in spirits or ghosts. But Mrs. Simmons' warning clung to me as I walked home. It wasn't fear I felt. Not exactly. It was something else. A pull, a whisper that begged me to look deeper into the mystery of the cemetery. Tomorrow, I would go. The next morning, the story about the cemetery was all I could think about. I tried to shake it off, but the more I thought about it, the more I felt like something was missing, something more to the tale that needed to be uncovered. And so, I began asking around. The first person I spoke to was Greg, a guy I went to high school with. He worked at the small mechanic shop on Main Street, the kind of place where the smell of oil and gas lingered in the air all day. I figured he'd be a good start. Greg was one of those people who didn't buy into superstitions. If anyone would have an explanation for the ghost stories, it'd be him. "Hey, Greg, you ever heard about the old cemetery on the outskirts of town?" I asked, trying to sound casual as I leaned against the counter. Greg glanced up from the car he was working on, wiping his hands with a rag. "That old thing?" He snorted, as if the idea was laughable. "Sure, I've heard the stories. People say it's haunted, but it's just some old graveyard. People disappear in that place because they're drunk or they get lost. Nothing paranormal about it." I raised an eyebrow. "Really?" I heard a lot of folks in town are scared to go near it. "Yeah, sure," Greg said with a shrug. "Some of the older folks like to spread ghost stories to keep the kids out of trouble. But you know how it is, towns like ours thrive on rumors. You want to know about real disappearances, there are way more suspicious things happening around here than an old cemetery." He clearly wasn't convinced, and I didn't press the matter any further with him. Greg wasn't the type to be easily swayed by anything supernatural. But his words felt hollow. There was something about the way he said it, like he was trying to convince himself more than me. I decided to talk to someone else, someone who might have a different take on it. That's when I ran into Carol, who worked at the local diner. Carol was a bit older than me, and her family had been in town for generations. I'd always found her stories of the past to be far more interesting than the usual gossip. If anyone had real knowledge about the cemetery, it would be Carol. I caught her during her lunch break, sitting on the diner's back porch, sipping her coffee. I took a seat across from her, and she gave me a tired smile. "So, what's this about the cemetery?" she asked. "I'm just curious," I began. "You know, I've been hearing rumors about it. Some people say there's a ghost haunting the place, others say it's dangerous to even go near it. What's the real story?" Carol hesitated, her eyes drifting toward the woods in the distance, as if she could already see the cemetery. Her hands tightened around her coffee mug. "You really want to know?" she asked, her voice low. "Yeah, I do." She took a long sip of her coffee, then leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They say that a long time ago, a woman was buried there. She was, well, let's just say she was a little different. People said she could commune with the dead. She had powers, or at least that's what they thought. One night, she disappeared, and they couldn't find her. People believe she's still there, still trying to reach out to the living. That's why no one goes near that place after dark." I frowned. "That's it? That's the whole story?" Carol nodded slowly. "Well, there's more, but it gets darker. People who've gone missing around here, young folks, mostly, some of them were last seen near that cemetery. I don't know if it's the woman's spirit or something else, but every few years, someone goes missing, and people say the cemetery has something to do with it." I could see the unease in her eyes, and it made my skin crawl. The way she spoke felt too real, too full of fear to be dismissed as mere superstition. "People think it's just a coincidence," she continued, "but I don't believe in coincidences. I don't go there, and I don't think anyone who does comes back the same." I sat there for a moment, absorbing her words. There was a clear divide in the town's perception of the cemetery. Some, like Greg, thought it was just an old place filled with rumors, while others, like Carol, had a real fear of it, something deeper than just ghost stories. Before I could ask her anything more, She stood up abruptly, a shadow crossing her face. I shouldn't be talking about this. You be careful, Alex. Some things are better left alone. I watched her walk back into the diner, her pace quickening. I sat there for a few minutes longer, the weight of her warning sinking in. There was clearly something more to this story. The cemetery wasn't just a place, it was part of something much larger, something that had been haunting the town for generations. And now, it was calling to me. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky bled into a deep purple, I couldn't ignore the pull of the cemetery any longer. The warnings I'd heard throughout the day, Greg's dismissals, Carol's fearful words, only seemed to make my curiosity grow. It was clear that no one was going to give me a straight answer. To find out the truth, I'd have to go there myself. I told myself it was just a cemetery, nothing more. Just a place where people were buried. But something in the back of my mind whispered that it was more than that. It had to be. I spent the afternoon preparing for my trip. The air outside had cooled, and the wind had picked up, rustling the leaves on the trees, making the world outside feel unnaturally quiet. I grabbed a flashlight, my old camera, and a notebook, tools for documenting anything strange I might encounter. I had to take this seriously, but at the same time, I knew deep down that I was still dismissing the possibility of anything supernatural. I texted my friends, telling them I was going to check out the cemetery for a little while. No one seemed too concerned. Greg texted back with a laugh, saying I should grab a cold one for him while I was out there. Max, always the skeptic, said he'd meet me there if I wanted company, but I knew he wouldn't actually come. Carol, however, was the one who seemed most adamant. She sent me a simple message, "Please don't go. You don't know what you're dealing with." I didn't respond. I wasn't about to let a few old stories stop me from finding answers. It was just a cemetery, after all. By the time I was ready to leave, the sun had fully set, and the town was quiet. The streetlights flickered in the distance as I drove toward the outskirts, my heart rate picking up as the familiar roads turned into dark stretches of winding pavement. The cemetery was about 15 minutes away, but the silence of the road made it feel much longer. As I neared the trees, I felt that unmistakable shift in the air. The temperature seemed to drop even further, and the woods on either side of the road grew denser, as if closing in on me. The headlights of my car barely cut through the darkness, and I could see the shadows of the trees stretching out across the path. I turned onto the narrow dirt road that led to the cemetery, and it was then that I saw it, a small, withered sign that read "Welcome to Evergreen Cemetery." It was so old that the words were barely legible, the wood rotting at the edges. I parked my car just beyond the gate, turned off the engine, and stepped out into the cool night air. The cemetery was quiet, eerily quiet. There was no sound of insects, no rustling of leaves. Just stillness, like the place had been abandoned for years. I shined my flashlight across the gravestones. They were old, some dating back over a century. Most of the stones were cracked or worn down by time, their inscriptions faded into obscurity. The overgrown grass crept up around the tombs, and vines had begun to crawl up the stone structures, twisting like veins under the surface. The whole place had a mournful feel to it. But I wasn't here for the scenery. I moved deeper into the cemetery, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the darkness, casting strange shadows on the old graves. The place felt wrong. There was an energy in the air that I couldn't explain. But I told myself it was nothing, a product of my nerves, that's all. I passed by rows of forgotten graves, some half buried in the soil, others surrounded by iron fences. As I ventured further in, The air grew colder, and the quiet began to feel heavier, as though the very space around me was holding its breath. The trees around the cemetery stood like silent sentinels, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. I stopped at a particularly old grave, one that had a strange symbol etched into the stone. It was a simple design, but there was something about it that sent a shiver down my spine. It didn't belong here. The symbol didn't match any of the others in the cemetery. I pulled out my notebook and began to jot down my thoughts, but as I wrote, I felt an unsettling presence, a tingling sensation at the back of my neck. It was like someone was watching me, though I couldn't see anyone around. My eyes darted to the shadows, and I realized the cemetery wasn't as empty as I had thought. The wind kicked up again, louder this time, and the trees groaned as if protesting my intrusion. I turned, intending to walk back toward the car, but that's when I saw it. A shadow, tall and thin, moving between the gravestones. My heart stopped. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then it moved again, shifting from one grave to the next. It wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too human in its movements. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The shadow stopped, and for a moment, I thought it was looking directly at me, though its features were hidden in the dark. The temperature around me seemed to drop even further, and the air grew thick with a sense of unease. I was no longer sure this was just a cemetery. I had read about places where the boundaries between the living and the dead were thin, places that carried a dark energy, a force that kept souls bound to the earth. Was this one of those places? I took a step back, my mind racing. The figure didn't move, but its presence weighed heavily on me, like it was drawing me in. Part of me wanted to turn and run, but another part, the part that had driven me here in the first place, wanted to move closer, to understand. I didn't know it then, but that was my first mistake. The cemetery had already begun to claim me. Night had fully settled over the cemetery by the time I made my way deeper into the graves, my footsteps muffled by the soft, damp earth beneath me. The air had a strange, heavy quality to it, thick and almost suffocating. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature seemed to hang in the air, wrapping itself around me like an invisible shroud. But I told myself it was just nerves, nothing more. I had heard enough about this place to be cautious, but I wasn't about to let a few ghost stories control my actions. I had come here to uncover the truth, to find answers, not to run back scared because of some silly noises or eerie feelings. Still, there was something undeniably off about the cemetery. The deeper I walked, the more the world around me seemed to quiet down. The usual hum of the night, crickets chirping, the rustle of leaves in the wind, was barely audible now. The trees surrounding the graveyard seemed to loom larger, casting long shadows that stretched out like dark fingers, reaching toward me. Every time the wind shifted, I swore I could hear whispers. Faint, distant murmurs, like voices carried on the breeze. I stopped and turned toward the sound, my flashlight sweeping across the rows of gravestones, but there was nothing. Just the shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. I shook my head and tried to focus. My mind was playing tricks on me. The last thing I needed was to get lost in my imagination. I took a deep breath and continued walking, my footsteps crunching softly on the gravel path. The cemetery was laid out in sections, with old, withered tombstones marking the graves of the long-forgotten. Some stones were cracked and toppled over, while others were barely legible, their inscriptions eroded by time. I couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness for the people buried here, those whose names had faded away with the years, whose lives had become nothing more than forgotten echoes. But even as I moved through the cemetery, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a shiver ran down my spine. The atmosphere was thick with something unspoken, like a presence that lingered just beyond the edge of my sight. I paused for a moment, listening intently. The air was completely still now, the silence pressing in on me. But then, I heard it, faint at first, almost inaudible, like a rustling of paper or a soft breath. A voice. I spun around, my flashlight flicking through the darkness, but there was nothing. Just the tombstones and the trees, their gnarled branches creaking as they swayed in the breeze. "Get a grip, Alex," I muttered to myself. "It's just the wind. It's just the wind." But even as I said it, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The whispers seemed to be getting louder, or maybe I was just imagining it. The wind picked up again, but this time it carried a strange undertone, a low, mournful wail that seemed to echo through the cemetery, a sound that sent a chill straight to my bones. I tried to laugh it off, to convince myself it was nothing, but my heartbeat quickened in my chest. It was as if the entire cemetery had become alive with the weight of its past, its dead not resting, but watching. Waiting. I took another step forward, determined to find out what was behind all the stories, behind the fear that gripped this place. But as I moved deeper into the cemetery, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were getting darker, more oppressive. It was as if the trees themselves were closing in on me, their branches hanging lower, blocking out the little light that remained from the moon. Then, from somewhere far off in the distance, I heard it again. A voice, low and soft, whispering in the wind. It was so faint that I wasn't sure if I had heard it at all, but this time I could have sworn it was saying my name. Alex. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. There was no mistaking it. Someone, or something, was calling me. I turned toward the sound, my flashlight trembling in my hand as I swept the beam across the cemetery. But the light fell only on gravestones and shadows. There was no one there. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and tried to convince myself it was just the wind, or maybe an animal. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. It felt too deliberate, too direct. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized the whispers weren't just in the wind. They were coming from the cemetery itself. It was as if the place had its own voice, its own consciousness, and it was reaching out to me. I couldn't deny it anymore. The stories weren't just stories. The cemetery was alive with something ancient, something that wasn't ready to let go. With each step I took, I felt myself sinking deeper into the heart of whatever this place was. The unease in the pit of my stomach grew stronger, and the whispers seemed to multiply, echoing from all directions. Something was waiting for me here, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to find out what it was. As I moved deeper into the cemetery, a strange, hollow feeling settled in my chest. The air was thick now, heavy with something I couldn't quite identify. My flashlight flickered as I walked, the beam casting long, trembling shadows over the gravestones, their sharp angles seeming to distort with each passing second. Every step I took felt like a step further into the unknown, like the ground beneath me was pulling me down, urging me to stay. Then, I heard it. A cry. It was soft at first, almost like a distant wail carried by the wind. But it wasn't the wind. No, this was something else, something unmistakably human. The sound was faint, yet piercing, like the cry of someone in pain, calling out in the night. My heart skipped a beat, and I stopped dead in my tracks. For a long moment, I stood there, listening. The cry was repeated, the weaker this time, as if the voice was fading away. It was coming from somewhere deep in the cemetery, beyond the rows of gravestones. It was faint, but unmistakably real. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and a cold shiver crawled down my spine. I had no idea what it was, but I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't just the wind. It wasn't an animal either. There was a human quality to it. And whatever it was calling me. I tried to shake off the fear creeping up my throat. I wasn't some naive fool easily scared by a sound in the night. I had come here to get answers, and now the stories that had haunted this place were beginning to feel like they might be more than just myths. Swallowing my fear, I turned toward the direction of the cry, gripping my flashlight tighter. My pulse quickened. Each footstep seemed to echo in the quiet, broken only by the distant rustling of leaves. The shadows stretched before me, as if guiding me, pulling me forward. I couldn't stop now, not after everything that had already happened tonight. There, near one of the older gravestones, I saw it. A shadowy figure, hunched and barely distinguishable from the darkness itself. It stood at the foot of a grave, the shape of it wavering in the moonlight. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a trick my eyes were playing on me. But then the figure moved. It wasn't quick or erratic, but slow, deliberate, like it was aware of my presence. The figure seemed to float just above the ground, its outline hazy, indistinct. The darkness around it thickened, and it was as if the very night had drawn itself closer to it, swallowing any remaining trace of light. I froze, the flashlight in my hand shaking. Was this the spirit the locals had spoken about? I didn't know what it was, but I couldn't bring myself to look away. A part of me, the part that had been drawn here by nothing more than the thrill of the unknown, wanted to run. But another part, the part that had dared to challenge the warnings, to uncover the truth, wanted to stay and find out more. The cry echoed again, this time clearer, closer. It was unmistakably human. A woman, I realized. Her voice trembled with fear and sorrow, carrying through the cold night air, drawing me in. Who are you? I called out, but I wasn't sure if I truly expected an answer. I couldn't see the figure clearly, but something about it seemed off. It didn't move like a person. It didn't breathe like a person. The figure didn't respond, but the air around me seemed to thicken, and the temperature dropped sharply. I could see my breath now, swirling in the icy air, visible and cold against the darkness. Please, leave, the voice whispered this time, softer, almost pleading. I stepped forward, instinctively reaching toward the shadow, my heart pounding. But as I did, I felt the ground beneath me shift, just a subtle movement, like the earth was quivering. I froze, my flashlight flickering in my hand. The figure hadn't moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was aware of me, aware of my every breath. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavy, echoed in the distance. I spun around, half expecting someone to be walking toward me, but there was no one. Just shadows, moving in ways they shouldn't. The wind had died down completely, and the cemetery seemed too quiet, too still. The figure remained, unmoving, by the gravestone. Despite the mounting fear in my chest, I couldn't tear myself away. Something inside me was pulling me closer, urging me to discover the truth. Was it really a spirit? Or was it something else, something more sinister, something that was never meant to be disturbed? I hesitated for a moment, heart racing, and then stepped forward again, moving closer to the figure. "Why are you here?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound steady. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it began to slowly turn, its form becoming even more indistinct, almost formless in the shifting darkness. As it moved, I saw the gravestone it had been near. The inscription was nearly worn away, but just legible enough to make out the name. Margaret LeClaire. The name rang a bell in my mind. I'd heard it before. I turned back to the figure, but it was gone. The cemetery was silent again, save for the faint rustle of leaves. The whispering had stopped, and the oppressive atmosphere that had gripped me just moments ago seemed to have lifted. I stood alone, the shadow now just a memory in the dark. Had I imagined it? I glanced down at the gravestone again, my heart hammering in my chest. No, this wasn't over. I had just scratched the surface. The stories, the warnings, they weren't just stories. And something about this place, something about Margaret LeClaire, wasn't finished with me yet. I had to know more. The cemetery was silent once more, the wind now barely a whisper. The oppressive weight that had hung in the air moments ago lifted as quickly as it had arrived. My breath came in sharp, shallow gasps, and I could feel the cold creeping deeper into my bones. My heart was still pounding in my chest, my senses on high alert, but the figure, the shadow that had stood so close to me, was gone. Had I imagined it? I didn't know. But the lingering feeling that something wasn't quite right refused to let go of me. The hairs on my neck prickled, and a cold shiver ran down my spine, like fingers of ice brushing against my skin. I glanced around, trying to make sense of it all, but the darkness around me seemed just as still and empty as before. The figure, that fleeting, inhuman presence, had disappeared as though it had never been there at all. Get a grip, Alex, I muttered to myself, forcing the words past the tightness in my throat. It was just a trick of the light. The wind, the shadows, you're just spooked. I tried to convince myself of that. I had come here to uncover the truth, to prove the stories wrong, but with each passing moment, it felt like I was sinking deeper into a place where reason didn't quite hold up. The stories I had dismissed so easily earlier seemed to gain weight, each passing second adding to the suffocating pressure building in my chest. I took a deep breath, the air sharp and cold, but still. I couldn't shake the unease. The atmosphere in the cemetery was thick now, as if the very air held something I couldn't see. A quiet hum, maybe, or something far more sinister lingering just out of sight. I started to walk again, though my steps felt too loud in the stillness. The crunch of gravel beneath my boots sounded deafening, the only sound breaking the silence. I tried to ignore the growing tension in my body, focusing on my breath, steadying my nerves, but my eyes kept darting to the gravestones around me, to the shadows beneath the trees, as if waiting for something to appear again. I glanced back over my shoulder once, then again. Nothing. Just the empty cemetery, the moonlight casting eerie shadows on the weathered stones. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was like the ground beneath me was alive, reacting to my presence. A sense of deep discomfort crawled up my spine, clinging to me like a second skin. It was as if the place itself resented my intrusion, like it had been disturbed, and now it was waiting. Watching. Focus, I told myself, trying to ignore the tightness in my chest. You're here to investigate. You're here for the truth. But truth or not, I couldn't help but feel that something was terribly wrong. The further I walked, the more I felt like I was being drawn deeper into the cemetery, as if the place was pulling me, urging me to go further. There was a strange weight to the air, heavy and cold, and for a moment, I wondered if the whispers I'd heard earlier were still there, lurking just beneath the surface of the night. A distant sound caught my attention then, another whisper. I stopped and turned, but it was gone as quickly as it had come. Just the rustle of the leaves in the trees. nothing else. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. My eyes flicked to every corner, every shadow, and when the flashlight flickered, I felt a momentary surge of panic. I tried shaking it, hoping it would stabilize, but it was stubborn. The beam of light wavered again, casting odd, flickering patterns on the gravestones around me. This was insane. I had to stay calm. I had to focus. But the cold feeling had settled deep into my bones now. It wasn't just the temperature, it was something far deeper, something that went beyond the physical chill. It was the feeling of being far too alone in a place that shouldn't be so empty. I glanced again toward the farthest corner of the cemetery, the place where the figure had been moments ago. The shadows there seemed darker now, as if something was shifting within them. But when I turned back, there was nothing there. No shape, no movement, just the same darkened graves, standing silent and unmoving in the quiet night. I stood there, frozen, trying to push the fear from my mind, trying to rationalize what I had seen. But deep down, the nagging suspicion I had ignored earlier grew stronger. The stories weren't just stories. There was something here. Something old, something that didn't want to be disturbed. My flashlight flickered once more, and this time it didn't come back on. The light died completely, leaving me in near darkness. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. I could feel it now, the weight of the unseen presence pressing in on me from all sides. It was too quiet, too still. And the shadows seemed to move ever so slightly, like they were reaching toward me. I cursed under my breath, fumbling to turn the flashlight back on, but it was useless. The small, flickering light was gone, leaving me standing alone in the dark. The quiet seemed to stretch for an eternity, and in that moment, the darkness felt alive, hungry, waiting, patient. I backed up a few steps, reaching for my phone, but my hands were shaking too badly to get a good grip. The glow from the screen barely cut through the blackness, but it was enough to show me that the cemetery had changed in a way I couldn't explain. The stones around me seemed to lean in, the air felt too thick to breathe. I glanced around once more, and when I looked at the gravestones again, I felt a sickening realization grip my chest. Some of the names on the stones were different. I hadn't noticed it before, but now, under the dim glow of my phone, I could make out the unfamiliar inscriptions. They weren't the same names I had seen earlier. They were new to me, at least. New, but not entirely unfamiliar. I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. The cemetery was alive with something I couldn't see. It had changed. It had marked me. And it was waiting for me to understand. The uneasy feeling in my chest hadn't lifted, and with each step I took, it grew heavier. I tried to focus, to convince myself that I was just imagining things, that the place wasn't as strange and alive as it felt. But as I walked deeper into the cemetery, I couldn't shake the sense that something had shifted. The air felt different, thicker somehow, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something. The wind, if it could even be called that, whispered through the trees, but it wasn't a natural breeze. It was sharp, unnatural, like it was trying to carry something with it. I could feel it now, tugging at the edges of my clothes, pulling at my hair. It wasn't cold, exactly. It was wrong. It felt as if the wind was moving around me, but not quite touching me, as though it was avoiding me, or perhaps waiting for me to make the wrong move. And then came the sound. At first, it was just a whisper in the distance, a faint cry that seemed so far away, it could have been part of my imagination. But the longer I stood there, trying to piece everything together, the closer it seemed to come. The cry had grown louder. It was no longer a distant wail. Now it was clearer, sharper, more desperate. I spun around, trying to locate the source. The cry was unmistakable, a voice, pleading, crying out in agony. I knew I should have left. Every part of me screamed that this was wrong, that I was in over my head, that the things people said about this cemetery, about the spirit, the entity, were more than just stories. They were warnings. And I should have listened. But for some reason, I couldn't stop myself. I had come this far. I had to find out what it all meant. The sound was coming from deeper within the cemetery, past a row of older graves, where the headstones seemed to be in various stages of decay. As I moved forward, I could feel the ground shift beneath me, the air growing even heavier. My flashlight flickered again, casting eerie, dancing shadows on the crumbling tombstones. Every step I took felt more hesitant than the last, as if something was pulling at my heels, urging me to turn back. But I couldn't. The cries grew louder still. They weren't just cries anymore. They had become words, fragments of speech, broken, fragmented syllables that seemed to swirl around me. I tried to make out what they were saying, but they came in such rapid, disjointed bursts that I couldn't keep up. The words sounded like they were pleading, begging for something, or warning me. But they were lost in the wind, and just as quickly as they appeared, they vanished. Suddenly, there was a change in the wind, a strange shift. It wasn't just the usual directionless gusts of the evening. The air seemed to move with purpose, as if it had a destination in mind. The wind pushed against me, tugging at my jacket, guiding me forward. It felt like the cemetery itself was directing me, pulling me deeper into its heart. I stopped for a moment, letting the breeze swirl around me, trying to understand what was happening. Everything felt off now, the wind, the sounds, even the ground beneath my feet. Nothing made sense. The cemetery, which had once been a simple collection of graves, had taken on a life of its own. It wasn't just a place anymore. It was something else. Something watching, waiting. The cries reached a new crescendo, a sharp, soul-piercing wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing through the darkness. The voice was no longer distant. It was right next to me, swirling in my ears, as if it were coming from the very air itself. My heart raced. I spun around again, but there was no one there, just the shadows, the gravestones, the trees stretching darkly against the sky. I felt the unmistakable pressure on my chest, the weight of something unseen. Something was in the air with me. Something was moving just out of my sight, watching me, reaching for me. The cries were still there, now mixed with soft, unintelligible murmurs, as if the very ground beneath me was speaking. I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't just stand here, lost in the echoes of voices and whispers. The pressure in my chest was suffocating, like invisible hands were closing in around me. I had to get out of here. I turned to leave, to retreat back toward the entrance, but the wind shifted again, stronger this time, pushing me back, as if the cemetery didn't want me to go. The air around me grew thick, almost suffocating, and I stumbled forward, fighting against the invisible force, trying to push through. But the cries were louder now, closer. And then, with a sudden jolt of panic, I realized they weren't just cries anymore. They were footsteps. I froze, my blood running cold as the sound of slow, deliberate steps reached my ears. The footsteps were dragging, uneven, heavy. They were coming toward me. I turned, heart hammering in my chest, but again, there was nothing. No one. Only the shifting shadows. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I looked around desperately, but there was no sign of anyone or anything. Just the dark, the graves, and the ever-encroaching shadows. The footsteps continued, dragging across the ground behind me. My breath caught in my throat, and I couldn't bring myself to look back. Someone, was following me. I couldn't explain it. There was something about this place now, something tangible in the air, something that was pulling at me. The footsteps that weren't mine, the cries that still echoed faintly in the distance, all seemed to blur together in a haze of confusion and fear. I wanted to run, to escape from this place that had grown so alien and sinister. But my feet wouldn't move. They were frozen to the ground, as though the earth itself had grabbed hold of me and refused to let go. I glanced around, trying to find something, anything, that could make sense of this nightmare. The darkness pressed in on me, thick and oppressive. The gravestones stood like silent sentinels, casting long, eerie shadows in the faint light. And then my eyes fell upon something different. A gravestone. It was weathered, older than the others, and set apart from the rest of the cemetery. The stone was cracked and worn, its inscription nearly impossible to read. There was an aura to it, a strange energy that seemed to hum in the air. It felt important. It was as if the stone had been waiting for me, calling to me in a way I couldn't understand. I moved toward it, my legs shaky, my feet dragging against the cold, uneven ground. My heart was pounding in my chest, each beat echoing like a drum in my ears. The cries had stopped, replaced by eerie silence, but that silence felt even more unnatural than the sound had. It was suffocating, like the world was holding its breath. As I approached the gravestone, I felt a chill slide down my spine, deeper than the cold that had already settled into my bones. My breath caught in my throat. The inscription on the stone was almost illegible, but there was something familiar about it. The letters blurred together, shifting in the dim light, but I could swear I saw something. A name I knew. I leaned closer, squinting to make out the faint markings, my hands trembling as I touched the cold surface of the stone. It felt unnatural against my fingertips, colder than anything I had ever felt. The stone seemed to pulse with a faint energy, as if it were alive. The name was unmistakable now, burning into my mind with a sudden, sharp clarity. It was my name. Alex. I blinked, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. There was no way. It couldn't be. I had to be mistaken. There were no other signs. There was nothing more than this vague, unsettling feeling that gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. Yet, the longer I stared at the stone, the more I felt an undeniable pull, a sensation that rooted me to the spot. It wasn't just the grave that was calling to me, it was something deeper, something connected to me in a way I couldn't begin to understand. The stone wasn't just a gravestone. It was a beacon. It was waiting for me. My heart raced, and a wave of dizziness hit me, the world around me spinning. I leaned forward, steadying myself against the gravestone, but the moment I touched it, everything stopped. The world around me seemed to freeze, as though time itself had come to a halt. I closed my eyes for a second, trying to gather myself, but when I opened them again, the grave wasn't the same. The letters on the stone had shifted, changing before my eyes. They had rearranged into something else, something I couldn't fully comprehend. The name on the stone wasn't mine anymore. It wasn't any name I recognized. I stepped back, my breath shallow, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. The gravestone seemed to loom larger now, its edges sharper, the air around it more oppressive. The wind had picked up again, but it was different now, thick with the scent of earth and decay, carrying with it something ancient, something buried. I could hear it again, faint but unmistakable, the distant cry. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a presence, reaching out to me, pulling me toward the grave. I could feel it in my chest, tugging at my very soul. I didn't want to go closer. I didn't want to feel whatever it was that had drawn me in so completely. But I couldn't resist. The pull was too strong. Something deep within me, the deepest, most primal part of me, was telling me that I had to go closer. That I had to understand. The air around me shifted again. The wind wasn't the only thing that had changed. The very ground beneath my feet seemed to ripple, to undulate like water, as if the cemetery itself was waking up, shifting beneath me. I stumbled, unable to keep my balance, as if the very earth had grown unstable, untrustworthy. I could hear the sound now. The footsteps. They were close. Too close. And yet, I couldn't tear my eyes away from the gravestone. It wasn't just calling to me now, it was pulling me, urging me to come closer. My feet moved of their own accord. I didn't tell them to. They just followed the pull, the force that had grown so strong I couldn't fight it anymore. The shadows around the grave deepened as I approached, and the cries grew louder, now not distant at all. They were here, surrounding me, coming from every direction. I was standing in front of the gravestone now, its weathered surface looming above me. The air was suffocating. The cries had become a chorus of voices, whispers and wails, all blending together, speaking in tongues I couldn't understand. The air was thick, and I could feel the weight of the grave, the weight of the cemetery, pressing down on me. The moment my fingers touched the gravestone again, everything fell silent. The cries, the whispers, the wind, everything gone. And then there was only the grave. Only the name, now clearer than ever, etched into the stone. And I realized, with a cold shiver down my spine, that the grave hadn't been calling to me at all. It had been waiting for me. I didn't have time to process what was happening. The world seemed to warp around me, as though the ground itself had come alive beneath my feet. One moment, I was standing before the gravestone, my hand still pressed against its cold surface, and the next, the earth gave way. My feet slipped out from under me, and the ground buckled as if it had been pulled out from beneath me. I reached out, but there was nothing to grab onto. The darkness around me seemed to close in tighter, and I tumbled forward, crashing into the dirt with a sickening thud. Pain shot up my arm as I tried to push myself up, my breath ragged, my heart pounding in my chest. My head swam with dizziness. I couldn't quite focus. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, and the ground felt wrong. It was soft, too soft, like the earth was swallowing me whole. I could feel the ground shift beneath me, as if it were alive, moving in ways it shouldn't. I had fallen into something. I forced myself to stand, pushing through the disorientation. My legs were unsteady, but I managed to rise to my feet, the weight of the air around me pressing down with a force I couldn't explain. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, a dark smudge in the corner of my vision. But as I turned, my stomach churned, and my heart skipped a beat. The shadow grew larger, darker, as if it were unfurling from the very air itself. It wasn't just a shadow. It was a figure. But it wasn't a shape I could understand. It was wrong. The figure hovered just at the edge of my sight, constantly shifting, like smoke caught in a whirlwind. It was neither human nor any kind of creature I could comprehend. Its edges blurred, its form ever-changing, like it was made of nothing but darkness and whispers. I couldn't look away. Despite every instinct in my body screaming at me to run, to escape, I was paralyzed. The figure loomed in the distance, but its presence was overwhelming, pressing against me from all sides. It was as if it knew me, saw me, felt me. It took a step forward, or at least, I think it did. I couldn't be sure. The ground beneath me shifted again, as if the earth itself were trembling in response to its movement. The shadows surrounding it seemed to stretch longer, curling and twisting in the air, like tendrils trying to reach out toward me. My breath caught in my throat. Every part of me screamed to flee, to run as fast as I could, but my legs refused to cooperate. I was stuck, trapped in place, forced to watch as the figure drew closer. The air around me grew colder, and I could see my breath fog in the air. Its shape flickered again, and then, for a moment, the figure solidified into something more distinct. It wasn't quite a person, but there was a vague silhouette, a silhouette that seemed to stretch unnaturally tall, almost impossibly thin. The darkness wrapped around it like a shroud, and for the briefest second, I thought I saw eyes, black, hollow pits, staring at me from within the figure. A deep, guttural sound echoed through the cemetery, something between a growl and a sigh, but it didn't come from the figure. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the very ground, from the air itself, as if the entire cemetery was alive with this sound. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears like a drum. Sweat poured down my face, and my body trembled. I couldn't move. I couldn't even think. The figure took another step forward, and the ground beneath me groaned, as though it were about to crack open. The world around me seemed to bend and stretch, and I felt myself being pulled toward it, like I was caught in its orbit. Suddenly, the figure lunged forward, if that's even what it was doing. Its form surged toward me, an inky black mass that seemed to swallow the light around it. I didn't have time to react. I barely had time to breathe before it was upon me. The air turned ice cold as it reached for me, the darkness wrapping around me like a vice. I could feel the weight of it pressing against my chest, smothering me, suffocating me. My lungs burned as if I were drowning. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to push against it, but my arms were heavy, numb, as though I were trapped in some kind of nightmare that refused to let go. And then, just as quickly as it had come, it stopped. The darkness receded, pulling back like a retreating tide. The figure dissolved, its shape disappearing into the shadows, leaving only the oppressive silence behind. I was left standing there, gasping for breath, unable to comprehend what had just happened. My body was trembling uncontrollably, my mind spinning with the weight of the encounter. What had that been? What was that? I stumbled backward, still dizzy, my hands grasping for something, anything, to steady myself. But my vision was blurry, and I couldn't focus. The air around me felt different now, thick and heavy, like something had shifted in the fabric of the world itself. I had no idea how long I stood there, frozen, too scared to move. The graveyard was silent once more, but the silence felt wrong. Empty. Something had been here. Something that didn't belong. And now it was gone. But the feeling remained. And I couldn't shake the sense that it wasn't truly gone. It was still watching. Waiting. The air was suffocating, thick with an unnatural stillness. I took a step back, eyes darting to the shadows that clung to the edges of the cemetery. My mind was spinning, trying to process what had just happened, the figure, the cold, the overwhelming darkness that had nearly consumed me. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. With shaky legs, I turned and started walking toward the entrance, my heart pounding harder with every step. The path I had taken earlier seemed clear enough, the gate not far from where I had entered. I knew I had only been in the cemetery for what felt like minutes, but the way of the place made it feel like hours had passed. I needed to escape. I had to get out. I pushed forward, but the moment my feet hit the ground, something felt off. The dirt beneath me felt softer, more uneven. The ground seemed to shift slightly with every step I took. I slowed, glancing back at the gravestones behind me. They looked wrong. The arrangement was different now, but I couldn't tell why. The angle of the shadows was skewed. The gravestones appeared to stretch in ways they hadn't before, as if they were alive, constantly changing. I turned back around and kept walking. But the more I moved, the more I realized nothing was familiar. I had passed the same tombstone 3 times now. I recognized the cracked marble, the faint etching of a name that had long since faded away. And yet, somehow, it had appeared ahead of me, as if the cemetery was shifting, the paths rearranging themselves with every step I took. There was no way this was real. I couldn't have possibly walked in a circle. I had to be hallucinating. I must have. My breath grew ragged, panic beginning to claw at the edges of my thoughts. The night was so still, so quiet, yet it felt like the cemetery was alive, watching me with unseen eyes. I kept walking, but now the quiet was suffocating. The cries from earlier had stopped completely, replaced by a deafening silence. I was the only sound in this place, each step echoing in the still air. Another turn. Another path. And once again, the same damn gravestone. I had to be losing my mind. I stopped and looked around, my hands trembling at my sides. The exit should have been visible by now, the edge of the cemetery, the road outside. But there was nothing but more graves, stretching on and on in every direction. The trees seemed to loom higher now, their branches tangled and reaching down like fingers, casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. A rush of cold fear swept over me. What was happening? How had I gotten trapped in this place? I tried to retrace my steps, turning back the way I thought I had come. But as I did, the scenery shifted again, more gravestones appeared, and the path grew narrower, darker. The once familiar landmarks were gone, replaced by twisted trees and stones that felt foreign. I had no idea where I was anymore. No, this couldn't be happening. I needed to think. I forced myself to breathe, taking slow, steadying breaths, trying to keep my panic at bay. I was still in control. I was fine. I just had to focus. I squinted into the distance, searching for any sign of the entrance, any familiar landmark, but there was nothing. Just darkness. The path before me stretched into an endless sea of graves and twisted trees, the air heavy with dread. I tried shouting, my voice breaking the silence, but my words only felt hollow in the air, swallowed by the oppressive night. "Hello?" I called. No answer. I gripped my head in my hands, the weight of panic crashing over me like a wave. This wasn't just my imagination. The cemetery was different now. It had changed. The ground, the paths, the very air, all of it was shifting, pulling me deeper into its maze, its grip tightening around me. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't give in to fear. I had to keep moving, keep searching. I straightened my back, steeling myself for whatever this place had become. The air was thick with something I couldn't name, but I forced myself to walk forward again. No matter how the landscape changed around me, no matter how twisted the path became, I had to find an exit. I had to escape. But with every step I took, the world around me felt smaller. The cemetery seemed to close in, as though it were watching, waiting for me to make a mistake, to fall deeper into its trap. My breath quickened, but I pushed through. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I knew I couldn't panic. Panic was what would keep me here. I had to think. The ground shifted again, but this time I heard something. A faint sound, footsteps echoing behind me. They were slow, deliberate. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. I turned quickly, but saw nothing. Just more graves. Just more shadows. I forced myself to move faster, my feet moving in a rhythm now, faster and faster, as if I could outrun whatever was behind me. But no matter how quickly I moved, no matter how far I walked, it felt like the cemetery was stretching endlessly, warping and shifting around me. I was no closer to the exit. I had no idea how long I'd been walking now, but the creeping fear was starting to turn to something more, something deeper. The cemetery was no longer just a place of death. It was alive, twisting itself around me, pulling me into its endless labyrinth. I couldn't tell if I was still in the same place or if I had entered a new part of the cemetery. Everything looked the same. The same weathered gravestones, the same shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. It was impossible to tell. I could feel it now, the presence that had been watching me all along. It was closer. I wasn't alone. I was being hunted. And there was no way out. I had been walking for what felt like hours, no, days. The cemetery had become a twisted maze that I could no longer make sense of, the graves stretching endlessly around me. Each time I thought I saw an exit, I was only met with more paths, more gravestones, and the growing sensation that something was following me. I kept my eyes trained ahead, willing myself to keep moving, to not give in to the mounting panic that gnawed at me. But every step felt heavier than the last, as though the ground itself was pulling me deeper into the earth. And then, as if in response to my desperation, I saw her. At first, it was just a movement in the distance, something dark and fleeting. A flicker of black among the sea of gray gravestones. I froze, eyes narrowing, scanning the shadows for any sign of the figure that had caught my attention. It was a woman. She stood by a large, weathered tombstone, her figure draped in an elegant black dress that seemed out of place in the darkness of the cemetery. Her long, black hair cascaded down her back in soft waves, blending into the night. I couldn't make out her face clearly, but there was something about her, something unsettling. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just stood there, staring at me from the distance. I could feel her eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. Her presence was suffocating, like a weight pressing against my chest. I wasn't sure if I should approach her or run. Something about her felt wrong. She didn't belong here. But I couldn't tear my gaze away. There was something magnetic about her, something that pulled me in, made me feel like I needed to understand her. My feet moved on their own, each step bringing me closer. And yet, no matter how much I walked, she never seemed to get any closer. She remained rooted to her spot, her body still as stone, her eyes fixed firmly on me. I stopped a few feet away from her, unsure of what to do. The air around me felt thick, like I was walking through molasses, and a chill crept up my spine, sending a shiver through my entire body. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice hoarse from fear, but it came out weaker than I had intended, swallowed by the oppressive silence. The woman in black didn't answer. She didn't even move. She just stood there, her figure stark against the night, as though she was both there and not there at the same time. I took another step forward, driven by an impulse I couldn't explain. But as soon as my foot touched the ground, I felt it, a sharp, icy sting that seemed to radiate up from the earth, crawling through my veins and freezing me from the inside out. My breath caught, and I stumbled back, shaking. No, this wasn't right. I was too close now. I couldn't explain it, but the closer I got, the more suffocating her presence became. It wasn't just her coldness, it was as though the very air around her was draining the life from me. The graveyard seemed to darken in her presence, the shadows growing deeper, the air thicker. It felt like the cemetery itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I looked at her again. She hadn't moved a single inch. She wasn't walking toward me, or speaking, or making any gestures. But I could feel it now, this overwhelming sense of dread, an invisible force pulling me in, urging me to step closer to her. Her stillness was almost more unsettling than anything I had encountered so far. There was something ancient in her presence, something that didn't belong to this world. I wasn't just looking at a person, I was looking at an entity, something trapped between the realms of the living and the dead. "Why are you here?" I asked again, my voice trembling with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Still, no answer. She stood there, unmoving, her form stark against the graveyard's darkness. And then, just as I thought I might lose my nerve entirely, her head tilted slightly to one side, as if considering me. I couldn't see her face, not clearly, but in that moment, I felt the weight of her gaze. It was as if she knew everything about me, every thought, every fear. She knew my name, my past, my regrets. A cold whisper curled through the air, faint and fragile, just beyond the edge of hearing. I leaned in, straining to catch the words, but it was like trying to listen to a voice carried on the wind. It wasn't words, exactly. More like a feeling, a presence. The feeling of being seen. Of being known in a way that no one should ever be known. My knees felt weak. I wanted to turn and run, to escape, but I was frozen, paralyzed by her presence. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. I wanted to move, but my body wouldn't obey. I was trapped in her gaze. Then, as if bored with the encounter, the woman in black slowly, deliberately, turned away. She didn't walk, she simply seemed to dissolve into the shadows, as though she was no longer there at all. One moment she was there, watching me, and the next, nothing. The silence in the cemetery was deafening. I stood there for a long time, unable to move, unable to speak. The weight of her presence still lingered in the air, heavy and suffocating. I didn't know what to make of it. Was she real? A figment of my imagination? Or something more? I couldn't answer that. But I knew one thing for sure. She wasn't the only thing watching me now. As the darkness settled around me, the feeling of being trapped deepened. The cemetery had shifted again, and I was once again lost in its maze. The way out was nowhere to be found. I stood frozen in place, the shadows closing in around me, thick with a suffocating cold that seemed to drain the warmth from my body. The woman in black, she was gone now, but her presence lingered, heavy and oppressive. It felt like the very air had shifted, thickened, and now every breath I took seemed to pull in more of the freezing emptiness that surrounded me. I tried to move, to take a step forward, but my legs felt like lead. The ground beneath me was no longer solid, it felt soft, like I was walking through something far deeper than just dirt and earth. The weight of the cemetery had increased, as though it was alive, pressing down on me, demanding my attention, my fear. And I could feel it now, this sense that I wasn't alone anymore. At first, it had been just the woman. But now, it was the cemetery itself. The very space around me felt controlled, watched, like someone was pulling the strings. I looked around, but everything seemed unchanged. The same gravestones, the same crooked trees, the same shifting paths that led nowhere. But the air was different. It felt colder now, almost painfully so. A frigid gust of wind whipped through the trees, sending a shiver through my body. I wrapped my arms tightly around myself, trying to hold on to some semblance of warmth, but it didn't help. The cold was inside me now, filling my chest, sinking into my bones. I could feel it, the weight of her absence. I had seen her once, but now she was everywhere. It was as if she had woven herself into the very fabric of this place, her essence imprinted on the land itself. The longer I stayed here, the more I felt her presence constricting around me, as though she was controlling the space I moved through. Every step I took seemed to echo unnaturally in the stillness, the sound of my shoes scraping against the earth amplified in the air. I looked over my shoulder, half expecting her to appear again, but there was only darkness, the same swirling shadows that had been following me from the very beginning. The wind howled louder, and my breath formed a visible cloud in the freezing air. My heart raced as I quickened my pace, my feet pounding against the uneven ground. But the faster I moved, the more oppressive the air became. It pressed in from all sides, thick with a weight I couldn't shake. The cemetery had turned into something alive, something that wasn't just watching me anymore, but responding to me. As I walked, I noticed something strange. There were no more sounds. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, no whispers in the wind. Everything was eerily silent, save for the sound of my own breath and footsteps. The usual hum of nature had been swallowed by the cold, by the presence that seemed to stretch endlessly through the cemetery. I stopped in my tracks, a sudden wave of nausea crashing over me. Something was wrong. I looked around again, scanning the familiar gravestones for any sign of change. Nothing. Everything still appeared the same, faded inscriptions, broken statues, and trees with gnarled limbs that seemed to reach for the sky. But the more I looked, the more I realized the small details that hadn't been there before. The twisted way the shadows fell, the strange shifting of the gravestones, the way the earth beneath my feet felt unstable, shifting with every step I took. The graveyard wasn't just changing. It was alive. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the trees, but it wasn't just any wind. It was colder, sharper. It cut through my jacket and straight into my skin. The chill was unbearable, the kind of cold that sank deep into your bones and made your heart feel frozen in your chest. I gasped for air, but it was like I couldn't get enough oxygen. My breath came in ragged bursts, my lungs straining, as though the air itself was being squeezed out of me. I stumbled backward, my vision blurring. Something was happening, something I couldn't understand. This wasn't normal. I glanced around again, but this time there was no sense of the familiar. The gravestones had lost their clear shapes, their usual order. They were twisting, bending, as if the ground itself was reshaping, distorting the landscape before my eyes. I took another step back, my mind racing. I had to get out. I had to find the exit. This wasn't just a haunted cemetery, it was a prison. And I was its prisoner. I could feel it now, pressing down on me, an invisible force, pulling me in. The cemetery wasn't just a place. It was a trap. A place controlled by the entity, that woman in black whose presence was more powerful than I had imagined. I didn't know who or what she was, but I knew one thing for sure: she wasn't done with me. The ground beneath my feet shifted again, more violently this time. I nearly lost my balance, falling to my knees as the earth seemed to tilt beneath me. When I looked up, the trees around me had begun to lean in, their twisted branches growing closer, reaching out like grasping hands. The air felt charged now, thick with something dark, something ancient that I couldn't comprehend. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her again. The woman in black. She stood in the distance, her silhouette a dark blot against the night. This time, she was closer. I could see her more clearly, her figure taller, more commanding. Her long black hair billowed in the wind, though it should have been still. The edges of her dress fluttered around her, though there was no breeze. She wasn't just watching me now. She was waiting. Waiting for me to make the next move. Waiting for me to fall deeper into her grasp. And I knew, with a cold certainty, that the cemetery wasn't just trapping me, it was drawing me to her. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My legs were frozen, rooted to the spot as I stared at the woman in black. She was closer now, closer than she had ever been. Her form was clearer, more distinct, and yet there was something about her that felt wrong, unnatural, as if she didn't belong in this world at all. I tried to speak, tried to shout, to demand answers, but my voice refused to come. It was like something was blocking it, trapping the words in my throat. My lips parted, but all that escaped was a strangled gasp. The woman didn't move. She didn't speak either. She just stood there, watching me with that same eerie, empty gaze. But then, whispers. Soft at first, barely a sound, as if carried by the wind. But they grew louder, clearer, until it felt as if 1,000 voices were echoing in my mind, all at once. The whispers were no longer just a sound, they were a presence, a force inside my head, pushing into my thoughts, invading my consciousness. I could hear them, though I didn't want to. They swirled and twisted in my mind, coming from every direction, yet there was no one around me. Leave, now! One voice hissed, barely audible, like a breath on the wind. Stay. Another voice, deeper, filled with an unsettling calm. You will never leave. This one, louder and more insistent, like it was speaking directly to me. It wasn't just words, it felt like a command. A promise. I could feel them, each voice sinking deeper into my skull, turning my thoughts into static, overwhelming my senses. The woman in black didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence was part of the horror, her stillness wrapping around me like a suffocating shroud. And the whispers, the way they echoed in my mind, bouncing off the walls of my skull, made everything feel real in a way I couldn't explain. Each whisper carried with it a sense of urgency, a feeling that I was trapped in something much bigger than I had ever imagined. Something ancient, powerful, and beyond understanding. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the voices, to quiet the chaos in my head. But they only grew louder, more insistent. Don't fight it. One voice cooed, soft and sweet, like a lullaby. But beneath that sweetness, there was an edge, a hunger. Come closer. I tried to take a step back, tried to pull away, but my legs wouldn't obey. It was as though the ground beneath me had turned to quicksand, holding me in place, keeping me rooted to the spot. I was trapped. With every whisper, I could feel myself slipping deeper into something dark. Something cold. She is the end, Another voice rasped, each word like a shard of glass being dragged across my soul. You will be the next one. My heart pounded in my chest, thudding painfully in my ears. Sweat poured down my back, but the cold was consuming me from the inside out. I could feel it, this chill, deep and penetrating, as if it wasn't just the air that was cold, it was my very blood, my bones, freezing solid. The woman in black took a step forward, her movements slow, deliberate, and as she did, the whispers intensified. I could hear them clearly now, as if they were not just thoughts, but voices in the very room with me. Their words crawled beneath my skin, wrapping around my thoughts, squeezing tighter with every passing second. You don't belong here. The voice was sharp, urgent now, filled with malice. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't escape. And then, through the mist of whispers, a single, piercing thought cut through the chaos, so clear and so certain that it shattered everything else. You are already hers. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My entire body stiffened, and for a moment, the world went silent. The whispers stopped. The air cleared. Everything stilled. But in that stillness, I felt the weight of something more terrifying than any sound. The woman's cold, unwavering gaze locked onto mine. And for the first time, I saw something in her eyes. It wasn't just cold. It wasn't just void. It was hunger. A dark, insatiable hunger. And it was turned toward me. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to break the hold that was tightening around me. But I couldn't. My body refused to obey. I was paralyzed, my limbs frozen as if in the grip of something far more powerful than my own will. And then, I felt it. The darkness that had been swirling around me shifted. It began to feel like it was no longer surrounding me, but inside me. It was crawling under my skin, seeping into my veins, filling me from the inside out. I gasped for air, but it was as if the air itself had turned to stone. I wasn't just hearing the whispers anymore. I wasn't just feeling her gaze. I was becoming her. The cold, the hunger, the darkness, it was mine. The woman in black took another step forward, and now I understood. She wasn't just watching me. She was waiting for me to surrender. To become part of the graveyard, to become part of the entity that controlled it. And all at once, I knew the truth. There was no escape. My heart was hammering in my chest, my breath shallow and erratic. I could feel the weight of the cemetery pressing in on me from every side, suffocating and oppressive. But it wasn't just the cemetery. It was her. The woman in black. She wasn't like the spirits I have read about in stories. She wasn't just a haunting or a restless soul. No, she was something else entirely. I tried to force my legs to move, to break free from the invisible chains that bound me to this cursed place, but it was useless. Every time I attempted to take a step, the ground felt heavier, more resistant, like it was dragging me deeper into the earth. I couldn't escape. Not physically, not mentally. She was the one who was in control now. I tried to focus on her again, to understand her, what she wanted. But as she stood there, motionless, her gaze still locked on mine, I felt a sickening realization crawl into my mind. She wasn't just watching me. She was manipulating me, her very presence distorting the world around us. The shadows, the cold, the whispers, they were all her doing. Her eyes, cold and empty, bored into me like twin pits of darkness, yet I couldn't pull away. They sucked me in, dragging me deeper into something darker, something otherworldly. I opened my mouth, trying to speak, but my words came out as a strained whisper. "Who are you?" There was no response. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge me in any way. But the air around me shifted again, and a voice, no, more like a thought, slithered into my mind. It wasn't her speaking, at least not with her lips, but it was her presence, her essence, her will. You cannot escape. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't anger. It was a statement of fact, a simple, terrifying truth. But the way she said it, the way it echoed in my skull, made me feel small, insignificant. I was no more than a speck in her world, a fleeting, insignificant thing that meant nothing to her. The weight of her presence was becoming unbearable, as if she was not only in my mind, but inside my very body, settling into my bones, curling around my heart. Every breath I took felt like it belonged to her, every thought distorted by her influence. I was no longer sure of anything. Was I still even standing? Was this real? Or was I losing myself in some dark, twisted nightmare? "You are hers now," the voice echoed again, but this time there was a tremor in it. A hint of something darker, something hungry. It wasn't just a warning. It was a command. And then, through the thickening fog of fear and confusion, I saw something else. A shift. The shadows seemed to stir, coiling around the cemetery like tendrils of smoke, wrapping themselves tighter around me. I could see them now. Faces. Twisted, contorted faces, their eyes wide with fear and their mouths open in silent screams. They were trapped in the shadows, part of the earth itself, buried deep beneath the stones and roots. And then I realized something horrifying. The woman in black wasn't the only one. She wasn't just a ghost, a haunting figure. She was a part of something. A force that had taken control of this place, this cemetery. She was a guardian, an enforcer of its rules. She was the keeper of the souls trapped here, doomed to wander the graveyard for eternity. But she wasn't warning me. No, she wasn't trying to save me. She was trying to stop me. Stop me from understanding. Stop me from realizing the truth. The truth that was starting to gnaw at the edges of my mind like an insidious poison. I wasn't the first to come here. I wouldn't be the last. The cemetery wasn't just haunted. It was alive. It wasn't just the woman who ruled here. It was the cemetery itself, the land, the earth. And it was hungry. Her presence grew stronger, more oppressive, filling the space around me, suffocating me with the knowledge that I was in the grip of something far older, far darker than I had ever imagined. Leave, the words slipped into my mind again, but this time it was laced with something else. Something final. A promise. Her figure started to move then, slowly, deliberately. Her feet didn't touch the ground. She hovered, just an inch above the earth, as if the graveyard itself was lifting her, carrying her forward. But she didn't walk like a normal ghost. No, her movements were jerky, unnatural, like the shifting of a thing not meant for this world. And then I understood. She wasn't a lost spirit. She was the graveyard soul. She was its eternal warden, its willing prisoner. She was a part of this place, bound to it. And now I could feel it, too. The pull, the weight of the land, the compulsion to remain, to stay, to never leave. I tried to fight it. Tried to remind myself that this wasn't real, that it couldn't be real. But the whispers grew louder, the shadows thicker, and the cold more consuming. I could feel the cemetery closing in on me, wrapping around my chest like a vice, squeezing the breath from my lungs. The woman's voice whispered in my mind again, clearer this time. "You are mine now." Her words weren't meant to comfort. They weren't meant to explain. They were a declaration. A command. The cemetery had claimed me, and no matter how much I tried to fight it, there was no way out. The entity had made its choice. And I was its next victim. My breath was ragged, my chest heaving with panic. I didn't know what was real anymore, or if any of this could be real. My mind was unraveling faster than I could keep up with it. The coldness clung to me, a weight I couldn't shake, as if the air itself had become dense, heavy, alive, and suffocating. The woman in black, the entity, was still there, somewhere, her presence looming over me like a storm cloud. But now, it wasn't just her I had to fear. The very cemetery itself had become my enemy. I turned, looking for a path, for an escape, for anything that might get me out of this place. The gravel paths I had walked on just moments before were now different, twisted, distorted. What had once been a straight road now led into a tangled maze of stones and overgrown grass. It was as if the cemetery was shifting beneath me, like a living thing, rearranging itself with every step I took. I stumbled forward, my legs shaky, each footstep growing heavier as the ground seemed to shift beneath me. I couldn't see where I was going. The trees that had once been far off were now closing in, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands, blocking my way. The headstones, once clear and upright, now leaned at impossible angles, their carved names almost indecipherable. It was as though the very earth beneath my feet had become a trap, pulling me deeper, sealing me in. The whispers, they had started again. Soft at first, like distant murmurs, but they grew louder with every passing second, more insistent, more pressing. They were coming from everywhere. From the trees. From the graves. From the very ground itself. I couldn't escape them. They filled my mind, a cacophony of voices all speaking at once, overlapping, twisting in on themselves. The words were indecipherable at first, just a mess of sounds, but then I could pick out phrases, fragmented, taunting. "Turn back, it's too late. We are watching, you can't run. She owns you now." I pressed my hands to my ears, desperate to block out the voices. But it was no use. The whispers had taken root inside my skull, and there was no escaping them. The air itself seemed to vibrate with their presence, each breath I took laced with fear. My legs ached from running, but I couldn't stop. I had to escape. I had to find a way out. But with each turn, each frantic step I took, the cemetery changed. The paths no longer made sense. What had been a straight shot only moments ago was now a winding, impossible loop, like a never-ending maze. I kept running, but every corner I turned led me to another gravestone, another stretch of earth that looked exactly like the last. The same twisted trees. The same crooked headstones. I couldn't tell if I was moving forward, backward, or just in place. It felt like the cemetery itself was toying with me. The entity, the force that controlled this place, was playing with my mind, manipulating the very space around me to trap me in its labyrinth. I reached for my phone, desperate to call for help, but the screen was blank. No signal. Nothing. I slammed it against a nearby gravestone in frustration, the cold stone echoing with a hollow thud. I wasn't going to get any help. There was no one to save me. I was alone. A strange, gut-wrenching laugh bubbled up from the depths of my throat, a laugh that wasn't mine. a laugh that came from the cemetery itself. It was as if the very earth beneath my feet was mocking me, twisting my thoughts, draining my will to fight. I started to slow, my legs heavy, my breath shallow. The cold seeped deeper into my bones, and I felt it. The cemetery wasn't just a place, it was alive. It was conscious, aware, and it was playing with me. Every time I tried to find an exit, every time I thought I saw a way out, it changed. I was running in circles, trapped in a nightmare that had no end. The whispers grew louder, more distorted, like a chorus of voices swirling around me. They were speaking to each other now, not just to me, as though they were discussing my fate. He can't escape, not now. Let him try. Let him see the truth. It's too late for him. He's ours now. I stumbled, my legs giving way beneath me. I fell to the ground, my palms scraping against the rough earth. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick, suffocating, and the sound of my racing heart was drowned out by the deafening whispers. The woman in black appeared before me, her form suddenly standing right in front of me. She was motionless, just watching. Her cold, empty eyes locked onto mine, and I could feel her gaze cutting through me, peeling away every last shred of my resolve. I opened my mouth to scream, to beg for mercy, but no sound came. The whispers had silenced me, had filled my mind so completely that I couldn't form words. She didn't move. She didn't speak. But I could hear her thoughts in my head, clear and unmistakable. You are part of this now. You always were. I didn't understand what she meant. What was happening to me? Was I losing my mind? Or had I always been meant to be here? Was I always destined to fall into this place? The realization hit me like a physical blow. The cemetery wasn't just trying to trap me. It was consuming me. And no matter how hard I tried, no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape. I had become part of the graveyard, part of its twisted, eternal labyrinth. I couldn't remember how long I had been wandering the cemetery. The minutes, hours, days, they had all blurred together, melted into one endless, suffocating stretch of darkness. The night seemed to stretch on forever, an oppressive weight that crushed the very air around me. Every corner I turned, every path I followed, led me back to the same place. The same twisted trees. The same crooked gravestones. I had stopped looking for an exit a long time ago. The thought of leaving seemed ridiculous now, like a distant memory that didn't belong to me. How had I even gotten here? The question swirled in my mind, but every time I tried to answer it, the memory slipped through my fingers like smoke. I reached for my phone, desperately hoping for a signal, something that could tell me where I was, why I was, or if this was real at all. But the screen remained black, as it had been for hours, maybe longer. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen a signal bar. There was no sign of life here, no connection to the outside world. The phone had become a useless object in my hand, a symbol of my isolation. I stumbled forward again, my legs heavy and unresponsive, each step dragging me deeper into the void of the cemetery. The air was still cold, biting at my skin, but it wasn't just the cold that made me feel numb. It was the feeling that nothing had changed. That nothing would. I would never leave. The ground beneath me shifted, the earth seemingly alive, groaning and cracking as if it were shifting its weight to trap me deeper. The sensation was growing more intense by the minute, like the very land was closing in on me. Every time I thought I saw a way out, it slipped away, replaced by another endless stretch of graves. The paths that had once seemed so clear now twisted and folded back on themselves in impossible ways. I couldn't tell if I was moving forward, backward, or just running in circles. Every step I took felt futile, like a mouse stuck in a maze, running for an exit that didn't exist. The cemetery wasn't just a place anymore. It had become a prison. Where am I? The words left my mouth in a hoarse whisper, but the wind quickly snatched them away, leaving me with only silence in response. The cemetery didn't answer. The only thing that answered was the weight of its presence, pressing on me from every side. I thought back to earlier, when I had first arrived. I had been so certain that I was just going to investigate a local legend to see if the stories were true. But now the stories didn't matter. This place wasn't just a cemetery. It wasn't just haunted by a ghost or a spirit. It was something far more dangerous, far more powerful. It was alive. And it wanted me to stay. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, lurking just beyond my sight, in the shadows between the gravestones. Every rustle of leaves made my heart race. Every distant creak of wood or snap of a twig made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the wind. I knew it. It was the cemetery itself. The dark figure, the woman in black, hadn't appeared again, but I could feel her presence all around me, as if she was waiting. Watching. Waiting for me to break. I didn't know how long I had been in the cemetery anymore. Time had ceased to matter. There was only the night, stretching on in a never-ending cycle. A cycle I was trapped in. My stomach twisted with hunger, but I couldn't remember when I had last eaten. My throat felt dry, and my hands were shaking from exhaustion, yet I kept moving. There was nothing else to do. The wind seemed to grow louder now, its mournful howl swirling around me, filling the air with its eerie song. The whispers had returned too, soft at first, but now growing clearer with each passing second. Lost, you're lost. It will never end. You can't remember. You can't leave. The words filled my mind, overwhelming me, drowning out everything else. I tried to push them away, but they wouldn't leave. I couldn't escape them. The darkness around me deepened, and my steps became slower, more sluggish. My eyes felt heavy, as though they were being weighed down by something. The world around me was becoming a blur, and I wasn't sure if I could keep my eyes open any longer. Had I fallen asleep? I forced myself to keep walking, though my movements were growing slower. The whispers seemed to swirl in the air around me, louder now, feeding off my fear, my desperation. And the shadows, they were closing in. I glanced around, trying to find something familiar, something that could guide me. But everything was distorted now. The gravestones were crooked, their inscriptions unreadable. The trees loomed over me, their branches twisting into shapes I couldn't comprehend. The cemetery had become a maze, a world of nightmares. There was no escape. There never had been. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if I even wanted to leave anymore. The longer I stayed, the more I felt connected to this place. As if I belonged here. As if the cemetery had become a part of me, just as it had become a part of the others who had wandered here before me. But in the pit of my stomach, I knew the truth. I was never getting out. This was my prison now. And the night, the endless, eternal night, was all that awaited me. I kept walking, the ground shifting beneath me with each step, as though the cemetery was moving in response to my every thought. The whispers had intensified, now echoing in my mind like a constant, maddening hum. It was like the cemetery itself was alive, pressing in on me from all directions, suffocating me with its presence. But then, something stopped me cold. The path I was on twisted again, as it always did, but this time it led me to something different, something familiar. The gravestones here were older, their surfaces cracked and worn by time, but the names, those names, were all too familiar. I stopped in front of one grave, the chill in the air sharp against my skin. My heart hammered in my chest, the air suddenly thick with a cold sweat. The name etched into the stone was Ryan Wells, one of the guys I had known since childhood. He was one of the first people who had warned me about the cemetery, telling me I shouldn't go, that it was dangerous. I remember laughing it off then. Now I felt the irony sting like a slap in the face. But it didn't stop there. The graves around Ryan's were familiar too, people I knew from town, people who had vanished over the years. There was Hannah Carter, the quiet girl who worked at the diner. Tommy Hayes, a local farmer. Each of their gravestones marked by years of decay, their names now a faded reminder of who they used to be. Each one had been here, just like me. Trapped. Lost. I walked along the row of graves, my mind racing. No way. This couldn't be real. They weren't just here. They were trapped. Their names weren't just on the gravestones, they were buried here, their lives stolen by the same force that had brought me to this place. I reached out and traced my fingers along the cold, weathered stone of Hannah's grave. The name felt like a cruel reminder that I was not the first to fall victim to this cemetery's curse. Ryan, Tommy, Hannah, they were all here, part of the cemetery now, just like the others before them, just like me. My stomach turned as I stepped back. My mind was racing. This wasn't just some random haunted place. The cemetery had taken them. It had taken me too, and it wasn't going to let us leave. It had trapped us. I looked around, my pulse quickening as I noticed something disturbing. The graves around me weren't just isolated. They were connected, as though the cemetery was built to gather the lost, to bring them all together in one twisted, unholy place. And it wasn't just the graves of the missing people I knew. There were more, too many more to count, names I didn't recognize, faces I had never seen. But I knew, deep down, they had all fallen prey to the same thing. The entity. I stumbled back, my breathing ragged. The realization hit me with brutal clarity. The cemetery didn't just trap people. It consumed them. The entity that haunted this place, that controlled it, fed off the souls of the lost. Once you set foot here, you were part of it, forever wandering the labyrinth of graves, lost and forgotten. And now, I was just another name in the long line of those who would never escape. Help, the word escaped my lips in a hoarse whisper, but I knew no one could hear me. The town was too far away. No one was coming. The ground beneath me seemed to pulse, like the beating of a heart, as if the cemetery itself was aware of my realization, aware of the fear that was beginning to take root deep inside me. I could almost feel the air around me crackling, a sense of anticipation building in the space around me. The entity, it was aware. It was watching. And it was not finished with me yet. I turned away from the graves, my heart pounding. The whispers were louder now, filling the air with their mocking tone, their cruel words. You are one of us now. You will never leave. The wind picked up again, swirling around me in a maddening gust. My head spun as I looked at the graves of my friends, knowing that each of them had once stood where I stood now, filled with hope, maybe even a sense of defiance, only to fall prey to the entity, swallowed by the very place they had tried to ignore. I reached out, a cold, trembling hand brushing against the stone of Tommy's grave, the name etched deeply into its surface. A feeling of emptiness washed over me, the weight of the loss overwhelming. How long had they been here? How long had I been here? Time had become meaningless, just another casualty in the cemetery's twisted game. I couldn't remember how many days I had wandered, how many hours had passed. Had I been here for a day? A week? More? And yet, the graves of my friends remained unchanged, their stones standing proudly even as the world around them decayed. I tried to swallow the knot of fear that had settled in my throat, but it wouldn't go away. I felt it, the presence of the entity, growing closer, its eyes trained on me from the shadows. It was watching, waiting for me to slip up, waiting for me to break. "You're all here," I muttered under my breath, staring at the endless line of graves that stretched out before me. We're all part of this place. The wind howled in response, and I knew, in that moment, that there was no turning back. I was trapped, just like everyone else. The cemetery had become an endless maze, a twisted labyrinth that stretched out before me, shifting with each turn. No matter how many paths I took, I always found myself back at the same spot, staring at the same gravestones, the same crooked trees. The air was thick with a palpable sense of wrongness, an energy that weighed down on me like a physical presence. I couldn't escape. I knew I couldn't. The feeling of being followed had grown so strong that it was like a shadow creeping just behind me, always lurking, just out of sight. My heart raced with each step, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Every rustle of leaves, every shift in the wind felt like it was a warning, a sign that something was close. I was being watched. I couldn't shake the feeling. It was almost tangible, like someone, or something, was breathing down my neck, hovering just behind me. I quickened my pace, my boots crunching on the dry earth as I moved faster, my eyes darting from side to side, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. I didn't want to turn around, but my fear was overwhelming. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, elongating with each step I took. It was as if they were bending, twisting to follow my every movement. Then it happened. I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, and heavy. I froze. For a moment, I thought maybe it was just the wind or the crunch of a branch snapping underfoot. But no! These steps were distinct. Too distinct. They were the sound of something, following me, stalking me. I turned around, my heart thudding loudly in my chest. Nothing. There was no one behind me. The path was empty, just a stretch of tombstones and gnarled trees, the wind whispering softly through the leaves. I swallowed hard, my breath shallow, my pulse racing in my ears. I knew I hadn't imagined it. The footsteps had been real. They had been right there, echoing in the silence. But now, they were gone. The emptiness before me seemed to mock my fear, as though the cemetery itself was toying with me, pulling me deeper into its grip. I hesitated, standing in the middle of the path, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Could it have been my mind playing tricks on me? Or was something following me, something I couldn't see? I shook my head, trying to push the panic away. I had to keep moving. If I stayed still, the fear would swallow me whole. I took a step forward, but the footsteps, they started again. Faint at first, barely noticeable. But there they were, steady and unmistakable. I spun around again, heart racing. Nothing. I could feel it now, the pressure on my chest, the growing weight of being watched. The cemetery felt smaller, more oppressive, like it was closing in around me. The feeling of being followed had gone from a vague unease to something far more real, an unmistakable presence behind me, just out of sight. I had no idea what it was. I couldn't even say if it was human. But I knew one thing for sure, it wasn't going to leave me alone. Every step I took was echoed by footsteps behind me. Every movement I made, every turn, every shift, was mirrored by that same slow, rhythmic pace. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was all in my head, but the sound never stopped. It was real. I broke into a run, the footsteps quickening as I ran. My lungs burned with each breath, my legs aching from the sudden exertion, but I couldn't stop. I had to get away. The footsteps were right behind me now, a heavy, ominous presence that pushed me forward, urging me to move faster. But no matter how fast I ran, they were always there, always right behind me. I couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything except the sound of my own panic breathing and the steps that followed mine, mocking me, hunting me. And then, as I turned a corner in the cemetery, desperate to escape, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, in front of me, was the woman, the figure in black. She stood at the far end of the path, still as stone, her face hidden in the shadows beneath the hood of her tattered cloak. I couldn't see her eyes, but I felt them, piercing, cold, watching. The footsteps behind me had stopped, but the presence was still there, surrounding me. The whispers in my mind grew louder, like voices calling out to me from every direction. You can't run. You can't hide. I felt the weight of her gaze even though she didn't move, didn't speak. The cemetery felt like it was closing in around me, the walls of stone and earth pressing tighter and tighter until I could barely breathe. She knew. She knew what I was feeling. The footsteps weren't just a trick of the mind. They weren't just in my head. They were the manifestation of the cemetery's hold over me, the entity's power. Every footstep, every step I took, was being watched, and I wasn't alone. I tried to run again, but the air had grown thick with dread, like a physical wall, pushing against me with every movement. I could feel the entity, the presence, closing in from all sides, pushing me toward the grave of my own demise. The footsteps started again. This time, they weren't behind me. They were in front of me. My thoughts were unraveling. The footsteps had stopped, but it didn't matter. The air around me was thick with something I couldn't name, something suffocating. A cold weight pressed down on my chest, and my mind began to splinter, the edges of reality blurring into something dark and impossible. The woman in black was still there, standing like a specter in the distance, her presence like a gravity well that pulled at my very soul. I wasn't sure where I was anymore. Every step I took felt wrong. The ground beneath me wasn't solid, as if it shifted with each stride, warping, twisting. My mind, no, my body, couldn't process it. Was I moving forward? Was I still in the same place? The graveyard had started to distort in my vision, as if the very space around me was warping into something alien. The familiar rows of gravestones now seemed like jagged teeth, ready to snap shut around me, trapping me in this endless nightmare. I tried to focus, but my thoughts were fraying, each one slipping away like sand through my fingers. My pulse thudded in my ears, louder than the whispers, louder than anything. Was I going crazy? No. I shook my head violently. I had to stay in control. This wasn't just my mind playing tricks on me. It couldn't be. The cemetery had a hold on me, a powerful grip that warped the world, warped my very senses. Every step I took felt like I was walking through a fevered dream. Things weren't real. But they were real, weren't they? I'm not imagining this. I can't be. The woman. She was still standing at the far end of the path, just out of reach, and yet it felt like she was closing in with every blink. I couldn't tear my eyes away from her. My legs refused to move, as though they were frozen in place, rooted to the earth by some invisible force. The whispers were growing louder now, a cacophony of voices that blended into a constant murmur in my skull. It was too much. You'll never leave. The voice, her voice, was inside my head now, and it wasn't just a whisper. It was a scream, an echo that rattled the walls of my mind, distorting everything. The sound of my breathing was drowned out by it. I clutched my head in my hands, trying to block out the noise, but it only grew louder, sharper, until it felt like the world itself was falling apart. Was it her? Was it the entity? I couldn't tell anymore. My perception was slipping, the line between the real world and whatever nightmare this place had become dissolving into an indistinguishable blur. The ground beneath me was no longer solid, no longer predictable. It shifted like liquid, bending and twisting with each step. What's happening to me? The air grew colder, biting at my skin, and I shuddered involuntarily. I could feel something behind me now, its presence pressing against my back, close enough that I could feel the chill of it, but when I turned, there was nothing. Nothing at all. I tried to breathe, to steady myself, but my breath came in short, ragged gasps. The panic was rising in my chest, clawing at my throat. Am I losing my mind? The question echoed in my thoughts, repeated over and over like a mantra. It was the only thing I could cling to, the only logical explanation for what I was experiencing. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. There had to be a rational explanation, something to cling to. But the more I thought about it, the more I wondered, is there? The cemetery, the graveyard, it wasn't natural. There was nothing rational about this place. It felt wrong in every sense. The walls of my sanity were crumbling, and with each passing second, I felt less like myself and more like a prisoner of this space. I wasn't imagining this. I wasn't crazy. The entity was controlling me. The footsteps behind me started again, not a faint echo this time, but solid, deliberate. They were closer, so much closer. I could feel them now, moving in rhythm with my own steps, as if the entity were walking beside me, inside me, taking me with it. I knew I had to run. I had to escape. But there was nowhere to run. I spun around once more, heart pounding in my chest, the woman still standing there, watching me from the shadows. Her face remained hidden beneath the hood of her cloak, but I could feel her eyes boring into me. My stomach twisted into knots as I tried to make sense of the madness around me. Am I imagining her? Was she really there? Or was it the cemetery, the entity, playing with my mind? I had no way of knowing. I could hear my own voice now, weak, trembling as I spoke aloud to myself. I'm not crazy. I'm not crazy. I'm not. But the words seemed hollow, empty, as if the very air around me was suffocating the truth. The whispers were drowning everything else out. I couldn't trust my own senses anymore. I couldn't trust anything. I staggered back, panic setting in, my heart pounding so loudly in my chest that I thought it would burst. The whispers, no, the voices, were everywhere now, a chorus of maddening noise that pressed against me, suffocating me. I couldn't think, couldn't focus. My mind was splintering, my thoughts becoming disconnected, fragmented. And yet, in the midst of the chaos, I knew one thing with horrifying certainty: the entity had already won. I was already lost. I was already part of this place. I had been walking for what felt like hours, though time itself seemed to have lost all meaning. The air was thick with dread, and the cemetery had become an oppressive, living thing, constantly shifting, turning its dark eye toward me. Every step I took felt heavier, as if the earth itself was trying to drag me down, to pull me into its depths. And then I saw it. The tombstone wasn't particularly remarkable at first glance, weathered, cracked with age, and buried among others that looked the same. It stood at an odd angle, half covered with moss and creeping ivy. But there was something about it, something that made my heart skip a beat. I couldn't explain why I was drawn to it, but my feet moved on their own, guiding me toward the stone, as though some invisible force were pulling me closer. I stopped in front of it, eyes wide as I studied the intricate markings carved into the surface. At first, they seemed like nothing more than random scratches, beware of time distorting any clear meaning. But then, a particular symbol stood out, a shape so familiar, so hauntingly familiar, that it made my blood run cold. It was the same symbol I had seen in my childhood. No, no, no! This can't be real. I stumbled backward, my legs shaking with the weight of what I was realizing. The symbol, it was from my past, from an old book I had once read as a child. A dark, twisted tale my mother had kept hidden, one that I had barely understood at the time. It was a symbol of an ancient curse, an emblem of something far older than anything I could have ever imagined. How had it ended up here, in this cemetery? Why was it etched into this grave? The questions tore at my mind, unraveling whatever was left of my sanity. This discovery didn't just unsettle me, it shattered the fragile thread of reality I had been holding on to. My chest tightened, and the air around me seemed to grow colder, heavier. I could feel my breath catching in my throat as my thoughts spun wildly. Could this be a coincidence? Could this old symbol just be a random carving? No. No, it wasn't. I knew it wasn't. There was no way. My heart raced as the memories came flooding back, vivid, painful flashes of my childhood. I had never forgotten the stories my mother told me late at night, the ones that she had desperately tried to keep me from exploring. The stories of a curse. A force that tied itself to bloodlines, to families, to the very land itself. I stepped closer to the tombstone, my eyes glued to the symbol, a sense of cold dread creeping through my veins. My mind screamed for me to turn away, to leave, to run. But I couldn't. Something deeper than fear was keeping me rooted to the spot, a pull that I couldn't understand. I reached out, my hand trembling, and brushed the cold stone with my fingertips. For a moment, nothing happened. But then, a soft, almost imperceptible sound reached my ears. A whisper. A voice, so faint that I almost thought it was my imagination. You remember. My breath caught in my throat. I jerked my hand back, stumbling away from the grave as a chill shot through my spine. The whisper, was it real? Had I imagined it? I didn't know anymore. All I could hear now was the pounding of my own heart, a deafening thud in my ears. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing behind me, watching. But the cemetery was silent, the wind rustling the dead leaves like a whispered secret. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. The air felt thick with the weight of it, as though the past itself had come alive and was reaching out, dragging me down into its dark depths. The symbol, it wasn't just a symbol. It was a mark that tied me to this place, to whatever malevolent force controlled it. The entity wasn't just some random ghost. It was something far more insidious, something that had been waiting for me. It had been waiting for years. I staggered back, my mind reeling. What did this mean? Why was I connected to this cemetery, to this curse? How had I never realized the link between the stories from my childhood and this place, this nightmare? The cemetery had never just been an abandoned plot of land. It had always been waiting for me, pulling me here. The past I had long buried was suddenly clawing its way to the surface. The entity wasn't just a ghost, it was a force tied to my own history, to my own blood. I began to back away from the tombstone, my legs shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The weight of it all was unbearable. I had to escape. But as I turned to leave, I heard it again. The whisper. You can't run from what you are. I froze. The voice, it wasn't in my head anymore. It was real. The words weren't coming from the cemetery. They were coming from inside me. The realization hit me like a tidal wave. I wasn't just trapped in this cemetery. I was marked, bound to this place in a way I could never escape. The entity, the spirit, whatever it wasn't just haunting me. It was part of me. I staggered away, my vision narrowing as panic surged through me. The ground felt like it was tilting, shifting beneath my feet. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. I needed to get out of here, but the path ahead seemed to close in, the graves lining the way like hungry teeth. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard footsteps. Closer. Louder. I wasn't alone. I was never alone. My mind was racing, every thought a jumbled mess, but one idea stood out like a beacon in the darkness: escape. I had to get out. The cemetery was suffocating me, closing in on all sides, its twisted, shifting paths designed to trap me forever. I had no plan, no strategy, just an overwhelming need to leave, to break free from whatever sinister force was controlling this place. And then, in my panic, the idea came to me: dig. I could dig my way out. Beneath the earth, the entity couldn't follow me. If I could just break through the soil, create a hole large enough, maybe I could crawl through it, escape from the cursed ground. The idea was absurd, but it was the only thing left in my mind. It felt like a desperate, last-ditch effort, something to do when you had nothing else. I scrambled to the nearest grave, my hands shaking, my breathing ragged. I fell to my knees beside a cracked stone, the earth soft and damp beneath my fingers. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a reminder of how little time I had left. The whispering voices were growing louder now, swirling around me, filling my mind with incomprehensible, maddening sounds. The entity wasn't far behind me. I could feel it, a presence just beyond my shoulder, watching, waiting. Ignoring the terror clawing at my chest, I started to dig. The earth was cool and soft, a stark contrast to the stifling heat that hung in the air. My hands tore into the ground, frantic, desperate. I didn't stop to think. I didn't care about the consequences. I just needed to make a hole deep enough, a space wide enough for me to crawl through. I was digging my way out, and nothing else mattered. With every handful of dirt I threw aside, the whispers grew louder, closer. The cemetery wasn't silent anymore. It was alive, breathing around me, its presence pressing down with unbearable weight. I could feel the ground beneath me pulsing, as though it was alive, as though it was watching me, laughing at my futile attempt to escape. I couldn't stop. I couldn't let myself think about how hopeless it all was. I had to keep going. The dirt was getting harder to move now, the ground becoming stubborn, resistant. My hands were raw, bleeding from the jagged stones and sharp twigs hidden beneath the surface. The cold seemed to seep through my skin, into my bones. The whispers, no, the voices, were starting to make sense, blending together into a single, haunting message. You can't leave. You belong to her. You belong to us. I flinched, the words seeping into my mind, crawling beneath my skin. The ground beneath me seemed to tremble with every word, as if the cemetery itself was alive, a living entity that was tied to my every movement. But I couldn't stop. I dug faster, my muscles aching, my breath shallow and erratic. I needed to break through. I needed to escape. And then, just as I thought I was making progress, the shovel hit something hard. I froze, my heart stopping in my chest. For a split second, I thought it was just a rock, some buried stone. But when I brushed the dirt aside, I realized it wasn't just a stone. It was something wrong. The object was cold to the touch, its surface smooth and strangely slick. It felt unnatural, wrong. My pulse quickened as I tried to pull the object free, but it was stuck, wedged deep into the earth. I couldn't understand what it was, but I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me as I worked to free it. And then, with one final tug, I pulled it free. A dark, withered box. A casket. The moment it came loose from the earth, the air around me grew still, too still. The whispers stopped. The silence was deafening. I stared at the box, my hands trembling as I held it in place. It was old, so old that I could barely make out the markings on the surface. But one thing was clear, it was not meant to be touched. I knew it. I felt it in my bones. This was something that had been buried for a reason. This was something that had no place in the world of the living. The cold that had been creeping up my spine intensified, and I could feel the ground shifting beneath me, the very earth trembling as though it were reacting to the disturbance. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps in the distance, slow, deliberate, and coming closer with every passing second. I had to get away. I had to leave before it was too late. But as I tried to scramble backward, my fingers slipping in the wet earth, I felt the ground tremble again, this time more violently. Something was rising from the depths. Something that had been buried for far too long. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, staring at the box in my hands, knowing that whatever was inside was now awake, and the entity was no longer just a presence. It was real. It was coming. I could hear its voice now, not in whispers, but in clear, chilling words, crawling into my mind like an insect. You can't escape, Alex. You are already one of us. The ground beneath me cracked open with a deafening roar, and I was thrown back onto the dirt as the entity emerged from the grave. I scrambled to my feet, panic flooding my body as I turned and ran. But it was no use. The cemetery was no longer just a prison, it was my grave. The ground had become an unyielding mass beneath my hands. I had expected it to be soft, maybe slightly damp, but this was different. The earth felt wrong, unnaturally hard, as if the soil itself had hardened into stone. My hands, already raw and bloody, struggled to make any dent in it. The shovel felt like a toy, useless against the thick, impenetrable surface that had swallowed the tombstone and the buried secret beneath it. I dug harder, my muscles aching, but the earth refused to give way. With each strike of the shovel, I felt more and more like I was fighting against something far larger than myself. The air was thick with tension, and a strange sense of pressure settled over me. At first, I chalked it up to the fear, to the dread that had been building in my chest. But now, as I continued to dig, I realized it wasn't just my own anxiety that was suffocating me. It was something in the air itself, a weight, a force that seemed to press down from all sides, bearing down on my chest, making it harder to breathe. I stopped, panting for breath, my heart hammering in my chest. My throat felt tight, my lungs straining to take in air. The world seemed to shrink around me, as if the cemetery itself were closing in. The trees, their branches twisted and gnarled, seemed to lean toward me, their shadows stretching like fingers, curling around my body, pinning me in place. The earth under my hands was cold, almost unnaturally so, and it pulsed with an ominous rhythm, like a heartbeat. My head was spinning, my vision blurring as the pressure in my chest grew, suffocating, pushing down on me from all directions. I tried to shake the feeling off, but it was impossible. The earth wasn't just dirt anymore. It was alive. It was aware. I dropped the shovel, my hands shaking, and pressed my palms to the ground, desperate for some kind of connection, something to show me that this wasn't real. But the moment my skin touched the earth, a sharp, agonizing pain shot through me. It was like the ground had turned to iron, and the pulse beneath it was no longer just a rhythm, it was an attack, a force pressing into my body, pushing against my bones. I gasped, pulling my hands back, my fingers numb. My breath came in ragged, desperate gasps as I staggered to my feet. The pressure in my chest was unbearable now, as if the cemetery itself was trying to crush the life out of me, suffocate me until I was nothing but a whisper lost in the dirt. I stumbled backward, my eyes scanning the horizon, but all I could see were the gravestones, endless, silent, watching. The shadows were closing in, stretching farther, reaching for me. The whispers, soft at first, were now louder, like a chorus of voices, hissing in my ears, taunting me with words I couldn't understand. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. What is this place? The thought echoed through my mind, frantic and disjointed, as I tried to stay grounded, to keep my bearings. But it felt as though the very earth was rising up against me, pushing me down, refusing to let me escape. The pressure was unbearable now. I could feel my heart thudding in my chest, my pulse quickening as I gasped for air that wouldn't come. The cemetery was alive, alive in a way I had never understood before. It wasn't just a place. It wasn't just a collection of gravestones and forgotten souls. It was a living, breathing entity, an entity that had claimed me the moment I stepped onto its cursed ground. I was no longer just a man trying to escape. I was a prisoner, and the weight of the earth was all around me, closing in tighter with every passing second. I turned and ran. My legs felt heavy, as if the earth itself was trying to keep me in place. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the cemetery itself was becoming more aware of my struggle. Every step I took felt like a battle against the very ground beneath me. Every breath was a fight to stay alive. The world around me was spinning, the cemetery shifting in unnatural ways, its paths twisting and turning, leading me deeper into its heart. I had no idea where I was anymore, no idea which way was out. The weight in my chest was suffocating. The whispers surrounded me, closing in, growing louder and louder. And then, as I stumbled through the graveyard, I heard it. A voice, clear, distinct, and familiar. "You can't escape, Alex." The words cut through the madness in my head, as if they had been waiting for the perfect moment. And when I looked up, I saw her. The woman in black. She was standing at the edge of the cemetery, her figure barely visible in the darkness. But I knew she was there. I could feel her. The pressure in my chest tightened and my vision blurred. My legs were weak, my body trembling, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let myself stop. I ran toward her. But the cemetery had already won. I couldn't breathe. I was running, stumbling, my chest tight, my heart racing. The path before me seemed to stretch endlessly, the gravestones becoming a blur of jagged shapes and shadows. The woman in black, she was gone, but her presence lingered, as if she had left a piece of herself behind. The cemetery was closing in on me, wrapping around me like a tightening noose. My legs felt like lead, and every breath I took was more labored than the last. I had no idea where I was going anymore. My feet moved on their own, driven by a need to get away, but the cemetery refused to let me leave. No matter which way I turned, it felt like I was walking in circles, the same twisted path leading me back to the same place. And then, I saw them. A figure appeared in front of me, stepping out of the shadows between two withered gravestones. At first, I thought it was another trick of the mind, some hallucination brought on by the pressure and the fear. But no! This figure was real. A man. His clothes were old-fashioned, his face gaunt, eyes hollow and sunken. He looked at me with desperate, empty eyes, and I felt an involuntary chill run down my spine. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, staring at me like he was waiting for something. For help. I didn't know what to do. My feet froze, my legs refusing to move. The air around us felt thick, suffocating, as if the cemetery was holding its breath, watching us. Please, the man finally spoke, his voice a rasping whisper. Help us. I took a step forward, instinctively reaching out to him, but as I did, something shifted in his gaze. His eyes lost all semblance of recognition, turning vacant, empty. It was as though the soul inside him had vanished, leaving behind only the hollow shell of a man. Before I could react, his figure began to fade, dissolving into the mist, his outline becoming blurry and indistinct. I reached out, my fingers grazing the air where he had been, but he was gone, vanished as if he had never existed. I was left standing in the middle of the graveyard, staring at the spot where he had been, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers began again, soft at first, then louder, more frantic. I looked around, and that's when I saw them, more figures, more souls wandering through the graveyard. They were all around me now, slowly fading in and out of view, each of them with the same vacant, lost expression in their eyes. There was a woman, her face twisted in silent agony, as though trapped in an endless scream. She reached for me, but her hand passed right through mine, her form flickering like a dying light. A child appeared next, holding a worn-out teddy bear, its button eyes staring blankly into the abyss. The child's mouth moved as if speaking, but no sound came from its lips. Instead, the whispering voices filled the air, their words unintelligible, frantic. Help us, a man's voice called out from behind me. I turned, heart racing, to find yet another figure standing there, his arms outstretched, his face filled with desperate longing. But again, his eyes were empty, lifeless. He seemed to plead with me, but his words never reached my ears, only the whispers, always the whispers. Help us, please, help us. I took a step forward, my mind racing. I couldn't stay here. I had to escape, but these souls, these figures, they were everywhere. There were so many of them now, wandering aimlessly, lost in the same eternal cycle, their eyes locked on me, waiting for something I couldn't give them. Each of them begged for help, but each of their eyes grew more vacant with every passing second. I reached out to one of them, but before I could even touch their hand, they faded away, slipping like smoke between my fingers. The cemetery was swallowing them up, one by one. And I realized, with a cold shiver running down my spine, that they weren't just ghosts. They were the lost, the forgotten, the souls who had wandered into this place and never left. The entity had claimed them, just as it was now claiming me. I was already becoming one of them. No, I thought, shaking my head. I can't be one of them. I can't. But my body moved without my consent, my feet carrying me toward the next ghostly figure that appeared before me. A woman, her face pale, her clothes ragged, reached for me with trembling hands. Her lips were moving, but all I could hear were the whispers, the cries that filled the air. Help! Help us! I tried to back away, to escape, but my body was moving too slowly. The cemetery wasn't just keeping me here. It was taking me, bit by bit, soul by soul, until I would fade away just like them. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the vacant eyes of the woman, her face twisted in a silent scream as her form began to dissipate. And then, like the others before me, I vanished into the endless void of the graveyard, lost to the weight of its eternal grasp. I could feel it now, the weight of the cemetery pressing in on me, heavier than ever. My chest tightened, each breath feeling like I was trying to inhale through a wall. The whispers around me grew louder, but now they weren't just fragmented voices, they were focused, sharp. There was something in the air, a presence that I couldn't see, but I could feel, crawling over my skin, curling around my spine. I tried to move, but my legs were uncooperative, like they were made of lead. I stumbled forward, the air thick and cold, and then, there it was. A voice. My name. Alex. It was soft at first, almost like a distant echo, but it quickly became louder, more insistent, until it reverberated through my entire body. It wasn't a familiar voice. It wasn't the voice of one of the lost souls, nor was it the voice of a woman in black. This voice was something else, something dark, something that made my blood run cold. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. I knew that voice wasn't human. I knew it wasn't a ghost. It was something else. Alex, the voice came again, low and cruel, curling around the edges of my mind like a serpent. I wanted to turn around, to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. My feet were frozen in place, my legs stiff and trembling. I could feel my pulse in my throat, choking me. The air around me seemed to thicken, pressing on me, suffocating me. You cannot escape, Alex. The voice didn't shout. It didn't need to. It resonated deep inside my skull, filling every corner of my mind. It was like the cemetery itself was speaking, like it had always been here, always watching, always waiting. You belong here now. My breath caught in my throat. The words were final, certain. They weren't just a warning, they were a command, a declaration of truth that left no room for doubt. I felt the weight of those words settle on me, crushing me beneath their weight. The voice was everywhere now, surrounding me, wrapping itself around my mind, whispering directly into the core of my being. I could no longer tell where I ended and the voice began. There is no escape. My eyes darted frantically around the cemetery, searching for any sign of the woman in black or the other souls who had drifted in and out of existence. But they were all gone now, nothing but empty graves and a vast, endless darkness. You will never leave this place, Alex. The voice laughed, but it wasn't a laugh. It was a sound that chilled me to the bone, like the creak of an ancient door opening in a forgotten crypt. The cemetery is your home now. You are one of us. Forever. The air seemed to thicken further, the pressure in my chest growing unbearable. My limbs shook, my heart a frantic drumbeat in my chest, but there was no escape from the voice, no escape from the grip the cemetery had on me. The ground beneath me felt as if it was beginning to pulse in rhythm with the voice, slow and deliberate, like the heartbeat of something ancient and malevolent. I struggled to form words, to cry out, but my throat was tight, like a vice squeezing the life out of me. The cemetery had taken my voice. It had taken everything. My hope. My sanity. I stumbled forward, my legs weak, my mind spiraling as the whispers grew louder, more oppressive. The voice no longer spoke to me in a calm, controlled manner. It had become more urgent, more insistent, like a looming presence closing in on me, ready to swallow me whole. You belong here, Alex. You were always meant to be here. The words hammered into my brain, each syllable a nail driving deeper, embedding itself into my thoughts. I was no longer Alex, the young man searching for a story. I was no longer anything but another lost soul in this God-forsaken place. I looked up, my eyes wild, and saw something moving in the distance, something darker than the shadows themselves. It was not a person, not a figure I recognized. It was a presence, a mass of darkness that seemed to shift and warp like a storm gathering in the night. And from that mass, the voice spoke again, louder, stronger than before. You are mine now. You will never leave. This is your eternity. I screamed. I tried to scream, but no sound came. The darkness closed in around me, and I realized then that the cemetery had been waiting for me all along, waiting for me to come, to step foot on its cursed earth. And now, there was no escape. I had to move. I had to get out. My pulse hammered in my chest, so loud it drowned out the whispers. But they were still there, growing louder and more frantic, creeping into the edges of my thoughts, gnawing at my mind. The voice, that deep, malevolent presence, was relentless. It had a grip on me now, and no matter how much I fought, I couldn't break free. I turned around and ran, my feet stumbling over the uneven ground, my body feeling heavy, like I was wading through thick, oppressive fog. My lungs burned with each breath, but I didn't care. I had to get out. I had to escape. But the cemetery was not the same as it had been when I first entered. The trees, those twisted, skeletal things, were no longer silent sentinels. They groaned, their branches bending in unnatural directions, twisting like broken fingers reaching for me. I looked up, and the sky above seemed to pulse, darkening in rhythm with the pounding of my heart. It wasn't night anymore. It wasn't anything. It was as if time itself had stopped, frozen in a suffocating haze. The ground trembled beneath me, a deep rumble that felt like the bones of the earth shifting. The very air felt alive, dense, thick, pulling me down. The cemetery itself was alive, aware of me, suffocating me. It was closing in, twisting itself around me, trapping me. I could hear the trees whispering now, their branches creaking in a language I couldn't understand. They seemed to move with purpose, bending toward me, blocking every path, hurting me deeper into the maze. I ran faster, my legs burning, my mind screaming, but it didn't matter. The more I ran, the more the cemetery seemed to shift and change, folding in on itself like a dark, insidious labyrinth. And then I heard it. The voice. You cannot escape, Alex. It was closer now, not echoing in the distance, but right behind me, like a breath on the back of my neck. You belong to me. I froze. My heart stopped. I couldn't breathe. It wasn't just a voice. It was a presence, a dark weight pressing in on me from all sides. The air thickened, became heavier, colder. It felt like I was being suffocated, like something was wrapping around my throat, squeezing tighter with every breath. The ground beneath my feet quaked again, but this time it wasn't just the earth, it was the entire cemetery shifting, reshaping itself to trap me. I looked around, desperately searching for a way out, but there was none. The trees had twisted so tightly around the paths that they seemed like walls, and the gravestones had started to lean in on me, their faces distorted, their shadows stretching longer and darker. The cemetery was alive. It was all around me, pressing in, forcing me to face the truth I had been avoiding. The entity wasn't just a spirit, a haunting, it was the cemetery itself. It was a living, breathing force, and it was hungry. You belong here now, the voice whispered again, colder than before, filled with a twisted sense of finality. You are part of this place, Alex. This is where you will stay. The ground trembled again, more violently this time. I felt it in my bones, a deep, grinding pulse that made the air hum with power. The cemetery was closing in on me, its trees, its graves, the earth beneath my feet, they were all shifting, closing ranks, tightening like a trap that had been waiting for me to wander too far. I ran again, my feet dragging, my breath ragged. The cemetery seemed to stretch and bend, but no matter which way I turned, I couldn't escape the feeling that the walls of this place were moving, changing, trapping me. Every path I took led me back to the same place, back to the center of the cemetery, where the woman in black had first appeared, where the shadows had started to creep. I stopped, gasping for air, my eyes wide with terror. The trees loomed above me like dark sentinels, their branches swaying in a way that seemed almost predatory. The earth beneath me seemed to pulse with life, as if it were alive, breathing. The air felt thick, impossibly heavy, like the very weight of the cemetery was pressing down on me. The voice came again, low and guttural, like a growl in the back of my mind. You cannot run from me, Alex. I am always here, always watching. You are mine now. The trees bent lower, their branches reaching for me like grasping hands. The ground beneath me cracked open, revealing dark shadows, tendrils of smoke twisting from the cracks. The air became colder, a biting chill that gnawed at my skin. I looked up, my eyes wild with panic, but there was no escape. No way out. And then, through the darkness, I saw it, something moving in the distance. Something large, something dark. The woman in black. The shadows seemed to gather around her, and I could feel the weight of the entity drawing closer. I tried to run, but it was no use. My legs gave out beneath me. I fell to the ground, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The ground shook again, and the cemetery seemed to collapse in on itself, the walls of trees closing in, the graves shifting, the very earth trembling as if it were alive, as if it were devouring me. The woman in black was closer now, her presence suffocating, the darkness around her consuming everything in its path. The voice, that terrible voice, echoed in my mind one final time. You will never leave, Alex. You are mine. And then, the darkness swallowed me whole. The cemetery had claimed me, and there was no escape. The ground beneath me trembled with a sickening rhythm as I stumbled through the darkened cemetery. My breath came in ragged gasps, each step heavier than the last. The trees pressed in from all sides, their gnarled branches reaching toward me like hands desperate to drag me down into the earth. The air was thick with a suffocating weight, a pressure that seemed to squeeze the very life out of me. I had been running for what felt like an eternity. The cemetery was a maze that folded in on itself, the paths shifting and twisting in ways that defied reason. It felt as though the place had a mind of its own, pulling me deeper and deeper into its heart. No matter how much I ran, how much I fought, I always seemed to be drawn to the center. And there, in the middle of it all, was where she waited. The woman in black. I felt her presence before I saw her, a coldness in the air, a darkness that seemed to swallow the light. My feet slowed to a stop as I reached the clearing at the cemetery's core. There she stood, as if she had always been there, waiting. She was no longer a shadow, no longer a fleeting figure lost in the dark. Now, she was real, solid, terrifying. Her form loomed before me like an impossible nightmare, her silhouette dark against the dim light that barely filtered through the twisted trees above. Her gown billowed around her, black as midnight, and her long, tangled hair fell in wild strands down her back. Her face, a grotesque mask of anguish, was twisted in a permanent scream, her eyes wide and empty, the whites of her eyes gleaming eerily in the moonlight. My stomach churned as I took in the sight of her. She wasn't just a ghost. She wasn't just a spirit tied to the cemetery. She was the cemetery. She was its heart, its soul, its keeper. I tried to speak, to move, but the words caught in my throat. My legs were frozen, and all I could do was stand there, watching her, feeling the weight of her gaze piercing through me. It was as if she could see every dark corner of my mind, every fear, every doubt. And she reveled in it. She tilted her head slightly, as though studying me, and for a moment I thought I heard her whispering something, her voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "You're late," she said softly, the words a rasping echo in my mind. My heart skipped a beat. I wanted to scream, but the words felt trapped inside me. There was no escaping her now. The realization hit me hard, like a punch to the chest. I had walked into her domain, her kingdom, and now I was here to stay. Her hands lifted slowly, her long, claw-like fingers curled, as though she were reaching for me. The shadows around her seemed to pulse, twisting and writhing in the air, taking shape, becoming more tangible, more alive. And then, she spoke again, her voice colder, filled with an unnatural force. "You belong to the cemetery now. There is no way out. You are mine." Her words twisted into my mind, each syllable digging deeper, carving a hole inside my chest. I wanted to resist. I wanted to fight back, to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. Her presence was overwhelming, suffocating, like the weight of the entire cemetery was pressing down on me. She stepped closer, the earth beneath her feet cracking and groaning with each movement, as if the ground itself feared her approach. Her face, contorted in that eternal scream, came closer to mine, and I could see the twisted madness in her eyes, the emptiness, the hunger. "You have come too far, Alex," she whispered, her voice now a soft lullaby of dread. "You are just another soul to add to the collection." Her hand shot out like lightning, and I felt an icy grip wrap around my throat, lifting me off the ground. I gasped, my hands clawing at her wrist, but her fingers were like iron, unyielding. The cemetery seemed to close in around me, the trees, the gravestones, all of it pushing toward me, as though the entire place was closing ranks, sealing me inside. My vision blurred, my breath shallow, but through the haze, I saw something, a flicker of light, a spark of hope. A memory. I thought of the symbol I had seen on the tombstone earlier, the strange markings that seemed to connect me to this place, to her. It was the same symbol I had seen when I was a child, the same one I had dismissed as a mere coincidence. But now, it wasn't a coincidence. It was a key. With every last ounce of strength, I reached into my pocket, my fingers trembling as I grasped the small pendant I had carried with me all my life. The symbol on it matched the one on the gravestone, the one that connected me to this place, to her. I held it out in front of me, and for the first time, I saw the woman in black flinch. Her grip loosened, just for a moment, but that moment was all I needed. I pulled the pendant closer to my chest, and the darkness around me seemed to recoil. The cemetery trembled, the air thickening and then breaking, as if the very foundation of this cursed place was starting to crack. The woman in black screamed, a sound that shook the very bones of the earth. But it wasn't a scream of triumph. It was a scream of fury, of desperation. And then, everything went black. The darkness swallowed me whole, pulling me deeper into its grasp. I gasped for air, but there was nothing, no breath, no sound. Only the deafening silence. My body felt weightless, suspended in an endless void. I couldn't tell if I was standing, floating, or falling. Time had no meaning here. And then, a voice. It wasn't the woman's voice, not exactly. This was something older, more ancient, a voice that seemed to come from the very ground beneath me. It filled my mind, twisting around my thoughts, suffocating me. "You think you can escape?" the voice crooned, cold and familiar. It had the sound of the woman in black, but it was deeper now, more powerful, as though it had been here long before I had ever set foot on this cursed ground. "You've come too far, Alex. There is no escape. Not for you. Not for any of us." A sharp pain shot through my chest, and I stumbled backward. The world around me flickered, flashes of light and shadow, images that made no sense. The cemetery. The woman. Ghostly faces staring at me from gravestones, their eyes hollow, their mouths open in eternal screams. Suddenly, I was no longer alone. The cemetery around me seemed to breathe, the earth beneath me shifting and pulsating as though it had a life of its own. The trees twisted unnaturally, their limbs outstretched, reaching, pulling me closer. And the woman in black, she appeared once more, standing at the edge of the clearing, her form more solid than before. But this time, there was something different about her. She wasn't just a spirit. She was the spirit. Her mouth opened, and the words that came out were no longer whispers, they were commands, raw and guttural, as though the earth itself was speaking through her. "I was once like you," she said, her voice echoing like 1,000 voices layered over each other. "A living soul, with a life ahead of me. But I wandered too close to the grave, and now I am bound here, just like the others." I staggered backward, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the truth creeping in, like a slow poison. "You don't understand," she continued, her eyes dark with malice. "This cemetery is not just a burial ground. It is a prison, and I am its warden. I died here long ago. My body lies beneath this earth, my soul chained to these graves. I have no rest, and neither will you." I tried to speak, but no words came. My mind raced, my thoughts scattered in 100 directions, but one thought lingered, one horrific realization. I wasn't the first to fall victim to the cemetery. I wasn't the first to be trapped. The ground beneath me began to tremble again, and the whispers grew louder. The spirits of the lost, of the missing, of the dead, they were all around me. their cold, empty eyes watching. They had all been brought here, just like me. All of them had been taken by her. This cemetery is not just a place where bodies are buried, she continued, her voice growing colder, more commanding. It's a trap, a place where the souls of the living are drawn, where they are caught and kept. And once you're here, once you've crossed the threshold, there is no leaving. You belong to me now. My heart stopped. I realized what she was saying. The entity, the woman in black, wasn't just a haunting. She was the very force that controlled the cemetery, a force that had existed long before I had even heard the legends. She had been waiting for someone like me. Someone foolish enough to wander too close, to disturb her peace. And now, she whispered, her voice a serpent's hiss, you are mine. Forever. My stomach turned as the weight of her words settled over me. There was no escape. No way out. The cemetery wasn't just a place. It was a prison, and I had stepped inside its walls. I had crossed the threshold, and now I was trapped. I tried to run, but my legs felt like lead. The air was thick, as though the very atmosphere was pushing me down, suffocating me. The cemetery, the trees, the gravestones, they were alive with a terrible presence. I could feel them watching me, closing in on me. There was no way to outrun it, no way to fight it. The more I struggled, the more the earth seemed to shift, to bend around me, sealing me in. The woman in black stepped closer, her twisted face full of grim satisfaction. She was the keeper of this place, and I was now just another soul to be collected. Another lost spirit in the endless graveyard. You belong to me now, she repeated, her voice soft, almost comforting in its finality. There is no escape from this place. You will walk these paths forever, just as I have. I looked around, my mind spinning. This was it. I was never leaving this place. Not alive. Not free. I was trapped, a prisoner of the cemetery, just like all the others. And as I realized the full horror of my situation, the ground beneath me seemed to open up, and the darkness closed in once again. I was lost forever. Panic surged through me like a tidal wave. My breath was shallow, and my heart was pounding in my chest, threatening to burst. I couldn't just stand there. I couldn't accept it. The woman in black was the embodiment of despair, but I had to try. I had to fight back. I scanned the ground desperately, my hands trembling as they reached for anything that might give me a chance. My fingers brushed against the jagged edge of a broken gravestone, half buried in the earth. I gripped it tightly, the stone cold and heavy in my hand. With a scream of defiance, I hurled the stone at her, but it passed through her as if she were nothing more than smoke. The woman didn't flinch. Her empty eyes met mine, the coldness in them growing like a storm cloud forming over a dark horizon. I staggered back, panic setting in as the reality of her power crushed my resolve. She was not of this world, nothing I threw at her would matter. Yet, I couldn't stop myself. I scrambled to my feet, my hands trembling as I searched for something else, anything that could give me an edge. I spotted a pile of rocks, half hidden by vines and leaves, remnants of a crumbled wall. I rushed toward it, throwing my weight into the motion. My fingers scraped against the rough stones as I grabbed handfuls of them and hurled them toward her, one after the other. Each rock passed through her like it was air, each one disintegrating in the instant it made contact. The woman's presence grew stronger, more intense with each failed attempt. "Stop it," she whispered, her voice so soft, so calm, it was more terrifying than any shout. Her eyes glowed with an unsettling light, and her thin lips twisted into a smile. You cannot fight what you cannot see. You cannot break free. I shook my head violently, a wave of frustration and fear crashing over me. I could feel her presence like a weight pressing down on me. It was as if the very ground beneath me was alive, pulsing with her power. The air was thick with her force, as though every inch of this cursed cemetery belonged to her. I looked around, my mind racing. The trees, were they shifting? The cemetery was alive with movement, with whispers. I could almost feel the earth itself pulling me deeper into its grasp, the dirt shifting like it was eager to swallow me whole. Why are you doing this? I shouted, the words sounding weak even to my own ears. What do you want from me? Her response was chilling, as if she were answering a question she had heard too many times. You are nothing. Just another lost soul, wandering where you shouldn't. You stumbled into my domain, and now you belong to it. To me. She stepped closer, her feet never touching the ground. She moved like smoke, her figure trailing in a dark mist that spread outward, filling every corner of the cemetery. The weight of her presence pressed down on me, squeezing the air from my lungs. I backed away, my legs shaky beneath me. Every step felt like I was sinking deeper into quicksand, the cemetery's darkness swallowing me whole. No, I'm not like them. I'm not like the others. She tilted her head, her gaze piercing. You are. You always were. I shook my head again, frantic now. I had to keep moving. I had to get out. There had to be a way. But the more I fought, the stronger her presence became. The air felt like it was thickening, each breath harder to take than the last. My chest tightened, the weight of her influence pressing down on me like a vice. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I could only feel the suffocating power of the cemetery, of the entity, closing in on me. No. I gasped, my voice barely a whisper. I stumbled, reaching out for the gravestones that lined the path, my fingers brushing against them for support. Please. Let me go. The woman's figure loomed over me, her face twisted into something that was no longer human. Her eyes, black as pitch, stared down at me with a quiet sadness. You cannot leave, she murmured, her voice now a soft lullaby. You're already gone. You've been here for so long, Alex. You just don't know it yet. And as I looked into her eyes, the ground beneath me shifted once again, pulling me down into the depths of the cemetery. The earth seemed to open up around me, its cold fingers grasping at my legs, my arms dragging me into the soil. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the earth, by the graveyard itself. No! I screamed again, but my voice fading as the earth closed in around me. And then, finally, the darkness swallowed me whole. My breath was ragged, every inhalation a struggle against the suffocating grip of the graveyard. I had no more strength left to fight, but there was something deep within me that refused to give in entirely. The woman in black stood before me, her figure taller now, more solid than ever. Her presence was overwhelming, suffocating, yet I still managed to speak through the fear that churned in my gut. Why me? I demanded, my voice shaky but defiant. Why did you choose me? What is it you want from me? She tilted her head, the dark hair falling in tangled waves over her shoulders. Her eyes, voids of nothingness, pierced through me as though she could see into the deepest corners of my soul. Her lips parted, revealing a smile that wasn't comforting, but cold, an expression that made my blood run cold. "It wasn't a choice," she whispered, her voice softer than it had ever been, as if she were sharing a secret. "You were always meant to join me. From the very beginning." I blinked, confusion clouding my mind as the words twisted in my ears. "What do you mean? I don't understand. How could this happen to me?" The woman in black took a step closer, her form moving as though the very air around her bowed to her will. The cemetery seemed to respond, its dark energy pressing closer, wrapping itself around me like a noose. "You were never supposed to leave," she continued, her voice low and eerie, like the whisper of wind through a graveyard at midnight. "This place, this cemetery, it doesn't just claim the souls of those who wander too close. It chooses. And you were always meant to come back." I shook my head, stumbling back a few steps, my mind racing. I don't belong here. I didn't know any of this. This is madness. You're lying." But the woman in black didn't argue. Instead, she moved closer, her shadow stretching across the ground like a dark omen. "It's not a lie, Alex. The graveyard calls to those who are lost, to those who need to be found. You were never truly alone. This place, this cursed land, knew you long before you ever set foot in it." I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. "No, I don't believe you." Her eyes darkened as if the very memory of my denial was an old, forgotten truth. "You think you wandered here by accident? That you came because of curiosity? No, Alex. Your past, your very bloodline, has always been tied to this place. You have always been one of us, even when you didn't know it." A chill ran through my spine as her words sunk in. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. "No, this isn't possible. My family, my past, none of this." "Your family," she interrupted, her voice now low and haunting, "has always walked this ground. Your ancestors, your blood, they were the ones who bound themselves to this place. And so, you were destined to return. Your curiosity, your search for answers, has led you back to where you belong." I could feel the weight of her words crushing down on me, pressing in from all sides. My head spun, the darkness of the cemetery growing thicker around me. My legs felt weak, as if the ground beneath me had turned to quicksand, pulling me deeper into its grasp. "You weren't meant to escape, Alex. No one who enters this place does. We all have our part to play in this endless cycle. You were always meant to join us. To stay here. Forever." Her words echoed in my mind, filling every corner of my consciousness. The realization hit me with the force of 1,000 blows. This was no random haunting. This was no accident. It was fate. My fate. You can't be serious," I gasped, my voice trembling. "You want me to stay here? With you? For eternity?" Her smile grew wider, crueler. "There is no escape. Not for you. Not for anyone. You have always been one of us, Alex. The cemetery is your home now, just as it was always meant to be." And in that moment, I understood. It wasn't just a haunting. It was my destiny. A destiny I had tried so hard to outrun. The woman in black was not just a spirit of the graveyard, she was a part of it, and now, so was I. I collapsed to my knees, the weight of her words pressing down on me like a suffocating fog. There was no way out. There never had been. My journey had always led me here, to this graveyard, to this moment. As the cemetery closed in around me, I could feel the entity's cold fingers wrap around my soul, dragging me into the shadows. The finality of it crushed every last spark of hope I had left. And as the world around me turned to black, I understood the truth. I had always belonged to the graveyard. And now, I would never leave. The ground beneath me trembled, a low, guttural rumble that seemed to come from deep within the earth. The air grew thick, heavy with the smell of damp soil and decay, as if the very foundations of the cemetery were shifting, groaning under the weight of some ancient force. I tried to move, to run, but my legs felt like lead. The shadows around me stretched and writhed, twisting into forms that were no longer just the cemetery's eerie landscape, but something far more sinister. The trees that had once stood tall now bent toward me, their twisted branches reaching like skeletal fingers, pulling me closer to the crumbling ground. The woman in black stood unmoving in front of me, her presence looming as the earth around her seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. Her face was a mask of cold satisfaction, her empty eyes watching as the graveyard began to collapse in on itself. "No!" I screamed, my voice cracking, a broken whisper against the growing cacophony of destruction. "No, this isn't happening." The ground beneath my feet cracked open, sending tremors through my body. I fell to my knees, the earth shifting violently around me. I could feel the cemetery pulling me into its depths, as though the soil itself had come alive, reaching out to swallow me whole. I struggled to stay upright, my fingers clawing at the dirt, but the more I fought, the harder the earth pushed back. My hands sunk into the soil, and it felt as though it was alive, crawling over my skin, pulling at me, dragging me deeper into the darkness below. "Please," I begged, my voice hoarse with terror. "Please, no more. I don't belong here." But there was no mercy. The earth was insistent, a heavy weight pressing down on me, dragging me toward a fate I could no longer escape. The cemetery had become a living, breathing entity, its roots snaking through the earth, entwining with mine, binding me to it. And then I heard it, the whispers again, louder than before. They filled my mind, suffocating, drowning out every other thought, every shred of my humanity. They weren't just voices now. They were feelings, emotions tangled together like knots in a web. Fear, hopelessness, rage, despair. They were all mine now, seeping into every part of me. I could no longer tell where the whispers ended and my thoughts began. I felt my mind unraveling, each piece of my sanity slipping away, disintegrating into the earth that was pulling me into its depths. I was no longer Alex, the young man who had once been curious about the stories, the ones who laughed and thought they could conquer anything. No, now I was just another soul, another lost soul trapped in the graveyard's unyielding grip. The cemetery was collapsing, but it was not a fall into oblivion. It was something more sinister, more ancient, a binding, a claim that stretched back centuries. The ground beneath me was no longer just dirt. It was a prison. The weight of it crushed me, and I could feel myself becoming one with it, becoming part of the curse that had claimed so many before me. The woman in black stepped forward, her form now indistinguishable from the shadows that surrounded me. She reached down, her cold fingers brushing against my forehead, and I felt a final surge of dread, like I was being sealed into something much larger than myself. "This is your home now, Alex," her voice echoed in my mind, a dark, final reminder. "You belong to the graveyard, just as they all do. Forever." As the last of my consciousness slipped away, the whispers turned into a single, unified voice that swallowed me whole, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, that I was lost forever. The ground closed over me. The cemetery claimed its final victim, and I became part of the curse that would never let me go. The sun had barely risen, its pale light casting long shadows over the cemetery. A cool mist hung in the air, the kind that clung to everything, dampening the ground and the trees, making the place feel even more oppressive than usual. Alex's friends, Jason, Sarah, and Emily, arrived with heavy hearts, their minds filled with dread and hope in equal measure. They had been searching for him for hours, ever since they received the call that he hadn't come back from the cemetery the previous night. Jason's hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel of his truck, glancing nervously at the others. "We need to find him. He's gotta be here somewhere. He wouldn't just disappear." Sarah, her face pale with worry, stared out the window at the looming cemetery ahead. "He was so sure about going alone," she murmured. "We told him not to, but he wouldn't listen." Emily, sitting quietly beside Sarah, clutched her phone tightly, hoping for some kind of sign, some message from Alex, but there was nothing. The silence between them was thick with unspoken fears. They knew the stories, the rumors, but they never imagined they would end up here, trying to find their friend in the same cursed place they had once laughed about. As they parked the truck and stepped out, the feeling of the place hit them immediately. The air was wrong, thick with something ancient, something hungry. The cemetery loomed ominously, its gates creaking in the wind, the crooked gravestones casting long, dark shadows. It felt as if the cemetery itself was watching them. The trio walked cautiously toward the center of the graveyard, their eyes scanning the area, hoping for some sign of Alex. The ground beneath their feet felt unnaturally still, the only sound being the soft rustling of leaves. But there was no sign of their friend. No trace of him anywhere. Jason's voice broke the silence. "There's no way he could have just disappeared. He was here, right? This is where he said he'd come." But as they reached the heart of the cemetery, something caught Emily's eye. A small piece of paper, crumpled and half buried in the dirt, lay near the base of an old oak tree. She bent down, her hand shaking as she picked it up, her breath catching in her throat. She unfolded the note, her eyes scanning the words. It was simple, haunting. "She's here." The words seemed to echo in her mind, resonating with a deep, primal terror. She looked up at Jason and Sarah, her face drained of color. I don't understand. Who left this?" Jason stepped forward, a chill creeping down his spine as he looked at the note. "It's his handwriting." Sarah shook her head, her heart pounding. "No. This doesn't make sense. He was alone, he couldn't have written this." But the note was undeniable. The words, scrawled hastily, were unmistakably Alex's. A surge of fear coursed through them all as the implications set in. They began to search again, more frantically this time. But the more they searched, the deeper their sense of unease grew. The cemetery, which had once seemed like an innocent location for a story, now felt alive with something dark. Something that had taken hold of Alex and wouldn't let go. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and for a brief moment they thought they heard something, a soft, distant sound, like a cry, almost lost to the howling wind. But when they stopped and listened, it was gone. They called out to Alex, their voices trembling with a mixture of fear and hope, but the only response was the whisper of the wind through the branches. Nothing more. The note was their only clue. And in their hearts, they knew what it meant. Alex wasn't coming back. As they left the cemetery, the air around them seemed to grow colder, and the shadows stretched longer. The feeling of being watched, of being followed, lingered with them all the way home. The note was the last thing they would ever find of Alex, and they would never forget the haunting words that echoed in their minds long after they left the cemetery. "She's here." Jason stood at the edge of the cemetery, watching his friends retreat toward the car. The faint cries that had haunted them still lingered in his ears, a haunting melody he couldn't shake. Despite the overwhelming sense of dread, he felt a flicker of defiance, a desire to prove that there was a rational explanation for everything. "I'm staying," he said, his voice firm as Emily and Sarah looked back at him, their faces pale and filled with unease. "I'm not leaving until I find Alex." Emily shook her head, grabbing his arm. "You heard the crying and the note. What if it's too late, Jason? What if Alex is—" "I'll be fine," he interrupted, trying to mask the uncertainty creeping into his voice. "There has to be a logical explanation for this. Alex probably just wandered off somewhere. You know he gets lost in his head sometimes." Jason's tone tried to sound confident, but inside, he wasn't so sure. He had always prided himself on his skepticism, on his ability to dismiss things as mere superstition. But now, standing alone in the cemetery, he couldn't ignore the creeping sensation of being watched. The air was thick with an unnatural coldness. The trees swayed silently, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. The ground felt heavier under his feet, as though the earth itself was reluctant to let him leave. With a final glance at his friends, Jason watched them climb into the car and drive away, their headlights disappearing into the distance. Alone now, the silence of the cemetery pressed in on him like a physical weight. He took a deep breath and made his way back into the heart of the graveyard, his footsteps slow and deliberate, trying to appear calm even though his heart was racing. The familiar path he had walked before now felt foreign and ominous, like the land was shifting beneath his very feet. As he moved deeper, the shadows between the gravestones seemed to stretch and shift in the corners of his vision. At first, he thought it was his imagination, just the wind playing tricks, but then he heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible, but undeniable. "Jason." He froze, his breath caught in his throat. The voice had come from nowhere and everywhere at once. His mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe his mind was playing tricks on him after everything he'd seen and heard. But then, there it was again. Jason. This time, closer. He spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. There was no one. Nothing but the empty cemetery, the ancient gravestones leaning at odd angles, their faces worn and cracked from years of weathering the elements. The whispers continued, soft and haunting, drifting through the air like the fluttering of pages in an old book. Jason shook his head, trying to push them away, but the voices became clearer, louder, filling the air around him. "Come closer, Jason." He couldn't breathe. A chill wrapped around him, settling deep into his bones. The sound of rustling leaves grew louder, and he turned again, his eyes darting across the rows of graves. A flicker of movement caught his eye, just a shadow, darting between the tombstones. He tried to convince himself it was nothing. A trick of the light, perhaps. The shadows were simply playing games with him. But there was something about the movement that felt alive, something that made his skin crawl. "You should leave, Jason." The voice came from behind him. Spinning around, he found himself face to face with nothing but darkness. The cemetery stretched out before him, its paths twisting in impossible directions, the air thick with a suffocating presence. Suddenly, from the corner of his eye, he saw it, movement at the far end of the cemetery. A figure, barely a silhouette, standing between two gravestones. A woman, dressed in black. He blinked, and she was gone. Jason's heart thudded painfully in his chest. He told himself to stay calm, to focus, to ignore the strange sensations creeping up his spine. But the cemetery was no longer familiar. The shadows had grown longer, and the air had thickened, heavy with an oppressive energy he couldn't explain. Again, the whispering voice reached him like a breath against his ear. "Come find me." He took a step backward, his foot crunching on the dry leaves beneath him. A soft groan echoed from the ground, as if the earth itself were alive, awakening. Jason's mind reeled. It wasn't possible. He had to be imagining it, he had to be. But there was no denying it. The sensation of something watching him, of being followed, was too real. The cemetery was alive with a presence, a force that had been waiting for someone like him to come. And just as the first real wave of panic began to rise in his chest, Jason saw it again. The figure in black. She was standing in front of him now, much closer than before, her pale face twisted in an eternal scream. Her eyes, dark, hollow, were fixed on him, as if she had been waiting for him to see her. Waiting for him to understand. He couldn't move. His legs felt like stone. His mind screamed for him to run, but his body refused to obey. "You're mine now," the voice whispered. "You're here to stay." Jason stumbled backward, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The earth beneath him shifted, as if the ground itself was swallowing him whole. Suddenly, the shadows closed in, and with a final, deafening whisper, Jason was engulfed. The last thing he saw was the woman in black, her face a mask of agony and fury. The cemetery had claimed him too. When Sarah and Emily returned later that day, they found no trace of Jason. No footprints, no signs of struggle. There was only the same quiet, oppressive silence. And in the center of the cemetery, beside the graves of Alex and the others, there was a new note on the ground. It read, "Come find me." Jason stumbled forward, his eyes scanning the rows of gravestones in front of him, his every instinct screaming that something was terribly wrong. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, as if the very land had stopped breathing. He had already wandered for what felt like hours, the shadows growing longer, stretching across the ground as the day began to fade into twilight. He was beginning to regret staying behind, despite his determination to prove that Alex's disappearance could be explained by something rational. He had no idea what it was, perhaps some sort of hidden passage, an elaborate trick played by the town's kids, or even some strange environmental anomaly. But as he walked further into the cemetery, the darkness seemed to deepen, and every sound became amplified. The whispering had stopped, but the weight of the place pressed on him more than ever. And then he saw it. A gravestone that stopped him dead in his tracks. At first, it seemed like just another weather marker, nothing special about it at all. But as he drew closer, his blood ran cold. The name on the stone was Alex Mitchell, his friend, the very person who had gone missing only the night before. But the dates, they were wrong. Jason blinked and leaned in closer, his heart pounding. The day of death was not from the previous night, as it should have been, but from years ago. "That's impossible," Jason muttered, running his fingers along the rough edges of the stone. His mind raced, searching for a reasonable explanation, but none came. Alex's name on the gravestone should have been a cruel prank, or perhaps a mistake, but there was something else about this stone that felt far too deliberate. A cold shiver crawled up his spine. A gnawing, irrational feeling tugged at him. He had been trying to tell himself that the cemetery was just a place, nothing more, but here, in front of him, stood undeniable proof that something was terribly wrong. Alex was here, but he couldn't have been. Jason thought. He shook his head, trying to force himself to think logically. But the unease grew, pulsing in the air like an electric charge. He felt it deep in his bones. The stone seemed to beckon him, pulling him toward it, towards something that he didn't want to understand. And before he could fully comprehend what was happening, the sensation of being watched overwhelmed him. It was as though the earth itself had started to breathe, its cold exhale seeping through the cracks in the soil. Jason stepped back, his breath shallow, as a distant noise reached his ears. The sound was faint at first, barely noticeable, but it was enough to stop him in his tracks. It was the soft rustling of fabric, the sound of something shifting. The woman in black. She was standing near the far edge of the cemetery, her face obscured by the shadow of the trees, but he could feel her presence like a sharp pain in his chest. It was the same sensation he'd felt earlier when the others had left, when he had first tried to dismiss the eerie atmosphere. Only now, there was no denying it. Jason's pulse quickened, his legs shaking. He turned to run, his instincts screaming at him to get out. But as he took a few steps, the ground beneath him shifted with an unnatural creak, and suddenly, everything seemed to blur. The cemetery was changing. The path that had once seemed clear was now gone, replaced by an impossible maze of gravestones. Trees twisted and contorted in grotesque shapes, and shadows, too many shadows, moved just beyond his vision. His breath hitched as he tried to push forward, but the more he struggled to move, the heavier the air became. His surroundings seemed to pull him in, trapping him in place. He had no idea how long he had been walking in circles, but he was sure that he wasn't going anywhere. Get out of here, he thought, panic setting in. I just need to leave. But no matter how fast he tried to run, the same towering gravestones seemed to appear in front of him, looming, dark, and unforgiving. The familiar sense of being watched returned, like invisible eyes were following his every move. Then he heard it, a voice, as soft as a whisper, but unmistakably close. Jason. His name echoed through the cemetery, but there was no one to be seen. His heart pounded in his chest. The sound came again, clearer now, as though it were inside his head. Jason, don't go. Something was coming. The pressure in the air grew heavier with each passing second. He could feel the weight of the land pressing against him, pulling him down. His legs grew weak, his breath shallow, as if something unseen was suffocating him. The whispers grew louder, filling his mind, drowning out all rational thought. They became his thoughts, a twisted reflection of his own fears. I should have left, Jason thought, but it was already too late. He took one last, frantic glance around, only to see the woman in black, standing right behind him, her eyes hollow and dark, her face frozen in an eternal scream. He could not move, could not speak. Before he could comprehend what was happening, the world went black. The cemetery swallowed him whole, and his body, like Alex's before him, became just another part of its cursed soil. The next day, Emily and Sarah returned to the cemetery, searching for their friend. The sun was high, and the place seemed eerily quiet, the air thick with an unshakable sense of foreboding. As they walked through the rows of graves, calling out for Jason, they stumbled upon a familiar gravestone, one they hadn't seen before. The name was clear, even though the stone looked as weathered and old as the rest. It read, Jason Ross. They gasped, their hearts sinking. But the dates, those dates were wrong, just like Alex's. The day of death was from years ago. The cold reality hit them hard, and their minds raced to explain away what they couldn't understand. But deep down, they knew. Just as they had feared. Jason was gone, too. And the cemetery was not finished with them yet. The days passed, and the town of Elmswood fell into an eerie quiet. Whispers began to spread, as they always did when tragedy struck, a mix of sorrow, fear, and disbelief. The locals spoke in hushed tones about the disappearances of Alex and Jason, but no one truly dared to speak of the cemetery in the open. The legend that had once been dismissed as old folklore had become all too real, and the shadow it cast over the town grew heavier with each passing day. The cemetery, seemingly untouched by time, stood at the edge of town, as it always had. It was still the same, silent, desolate, and eternal. No one dared to approach it anymore, except for a few curious souls who thought they could unravel the mystery for themselves, only to disappear like the others before them. They, too, would leave behind nothing but their names, carved into the cold stone of the gravestones. The townsfolk said that at night, if you stood far enough away, you could hear faint whispers carried by the wind. Some claimed to hear cries in the distance, voices full of longing and sorrow, echoing from the depths of the graveyard. Others swore they saw shadows flicker behind the iron gates, figures that didn't belong, moving in and out of sight as though they were never really there. The name of the cemetery was now spoken with a shiver, a word that brought a chill to the bones. No one dared to step near the gates, not since Alex had gone in search of answers and never returned. And as the years passed, the list of names on the gravestones grew longer, with no explanation, no closure. More souls were taken, one by one, trapped within the cemetery's unyielding grip. The townspeople avoided the place, but they couldn't escape the fear it planted in their hearts. It hung in the air like smoke, ever present, suffocating their thoughts. They had learned to live with the terror, but they had also learned to fear the silence, the creeping sensation that something unseen was watching from just beyond the edge of the graveyard. And the worst part of it all? The cemetery was still there. Its grip on the land, on the souls of the lost, had only tightened with time. The woman in black, her permanent scream locked in the twisted, hollow expression of her face, was still there, waiting. And the entity, whatever she was, never left. She never had. The ones who visited, curious or desperate, never returned, each name added to the growing list of the forgotten. The town moved on, but the legend of the graveyard endured, growing darker with each passing year, as each new soul vanished into its cursed soil. Some believed it was a warning, others a curse too powerful to break. The truth was far worse. The cemetery wasn't just a place, it was a force, an entity that lived and breathed in the quiet corners of the world, reaching out to claim those who dared to trespass. And it was only a matter of time before the cemetery claimed more. As the sun set on the horizon, casting a red glow over the cemetery's iron gates, the whispers began again, quiet at first, barely audible, but rising steadily into the air. The legend was alive, and the town was no longer safe. It would never be safe again. And so, the cemetery stood, untouched and eternal, a haunting reminder that some stories were meant to never end, their darkness never to be fully understood. The souls lost within its boundaries would remain there, forever, trapped in its curse, while the town lived in fear of the day that the cemetery's grip would once again reach beyond its gates. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, Unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.